Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Urban Fae, The Geas, Part 1, by Michael Lockhart. Wham! 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 Fobar! I screamed, in my startled and sudden terror-stricken mind, and maybe out loud. I couldn't tell what with the bells of Notre Dame ringing in my ear. Mortal turds were once again shooting at me. I dove for cover, such as it was, behind a garish, pleather couch with a tall back, typically used as a base for dancers to dry hump, or otherwise their customers in semi-privacy. It was more concealment than cover, but it would have to do until I could flee or scramble to something better. Great, I thought. Wonderful way to end things. My Sorsha certainly wasn't going to be happy with me in Sony's crappy topless joint. It had been an eventful recent time, leading up to my current misery. Didn't start out so bad, yet here I was, caught in a gangland crossfire. Snafu, the story of my life. We didn't have to wait until Thanksgiving for the uncomfortable family gathering. The Gosling family gathered at Beltane Eve and Beltane. Sorsha caught me at breakfast and warned me, "Rob, we will have to break bread with Siobhan and Kotka soon. It's a big holiday for us, so no choice. Besides, while Mom plays along with us, she really dwells in the world of denial. She is completely sure that underneath all the play acting, we are good Catholics. Besides, we're her daughters, so she will always try and love us equally, regardless of whether one is weird and the other is a snotty, evil thing." She smiled at the last. I smiled in return. I was just thinking. Siobhan was at the memorial service, but I never saw her. Of course, it was packed, but I didn't see her here afterwards either. Was she hiding? Sorsha nodded. Definitely. She could easily have had a glamour in place that was specific to you. At the time, you had no way of detecting her subterfuge. By the way, our brother Shane doesn't always make these events. He's the least Fae of us all. When there are multiple children, it seems to work that way. Don't get me wrong, he's exceptional for a mundane, but that's still what he is. Besides, it's hard for soldiers to get loose, even officers. He's getting out soon, though. No life or role for him. He wanted to go with the contractors earlier in his career. Maybe the same firm as Dad, having been among the first Space Force members, should help him. I nodded along. I'd known that much, and not much more about her brother Shane. He seemed a nice sort, a little stiff, self-disciplined, and it was easy to tell that he liked rules and order. A soldier, or in his case, a guardian to the core. So, when I was around your dad, he was already a contractor, but we never really talked about the specifics. I know he looked after my folks, but he had to have been doing something for a living. They certainly didn't have the means to pay him. She looked hard at me and then shook her head in amazement and pity. You really don't know about your parents, do you? They had means aplenty and the ability to get as much as they needed at any time. However, they didn't want to leave too much of a trail or to stand out, as wealthy people tend to do on this side. Besides, they never have to pay Dad. We had a family obligation, a connection in both worlds. She paused to brush some of her stray locks from her eyes. They tended to go whither they would, and I enjoyed watching them do so. As for his work, Dad was mostly a researcher and writer. He wrote policy manuals for defense contractors and instruction manuals for items they built. He spoke professionally and quite often to explain or market their products, since in writing about them, he often had a better view of the mechanics as they were related to the real-world operations and applications than did the designers. Further, the products were primarily for military use, and he knew troops. So what did they make? Those $800 toilets? $500,000 four-wheelers? I used a tone that was light rather than sarcastic. It was not in any way to make fun of Mr. G. She knew I'd never mock that man. Even if I'd never met him, he was her father, so I was automatically on his side. That didn't apply to her sister, though. She shrugged. Not really sure. It was all Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA stuff. Creepy department, DARPA. I know he had a super drone to play with for a couple of weeks last year. None of us were supposed to know, but I was his favorite. Besides, whom would I tell? The rest was more deeply classified. I realized she would not get around to volunteering the information, so I gave up and asked, "So what do we actually do for Beltane?" She enthusiastically explained the history and purpose of the holiday. Essentially, a celebration of life and light, the way that Samhain marks the passage of dark. At least, that's the gist of it, as she elucidated. She went off on a few tangents about what heathens and neo-pagans and other groups did, but the main point was that it was time for beginnings. "It's the day in my family when we have weddings," she declared. I almost choked on my iced tea. It must have looked like the proverbial deer in the headlights. I loved her and all, but there was no way in this world I could support a wife. In this world. Besides, I just wasn't ready. She giggled at my obvious discomfiture and assumed a slack, eye-rolling persona. "Don't be scared, Robbie. I'll be a good fairy queen for your double wide. You gotta get me one of them there double wides. I ain't staying in no regular trailer, nor any certified apartments." Her giggles developed into uproarious laughter. She is so weird. I laughed internally, and eventually it emerged into a physical realm, though less raucously than hers. She was one of the few who could engender a humorous response from me. Most of the time I relied on my acerbic internal dialogue for comedy. The moment passed. Seriously, Coyote, we haven't known each other long enough to even contemplate marriage. You are mine, never forget it. My Anam Kara, my soul friend. We are bonded, but you aren't ready for the next step, and neither am I. We still have much to learn about one another. Oh, and I don't actually have any qualms about manufactured houses or RV trailers or apartments. I'm a little spoiled by my current abode, but I'm not some snobbish jerk. She took my hand in hers. I always liked it when she did that. It brought instant calm, instant assurance that I was where I should be, and the world was right. I just wish it would stay that way for a little longer at a time. "Urgh," I growled internally. I had to step outside for a break from the family tension. Sorsha, more accustomed to it than I, remained inside and worked with Siobhan and Kotka to prepare for whatever ceremonies they had in mind. Miss Eli was a staunch Catholic, so she'd gone to bed, and likely to pray that we'd all change and switch over to her way of believing. Not bloody likely. I inwardly channeled a line from an old movie delivered expertly by Sean Connery, and I always heard it in his voice when I recalled the soliloquy. She was likely playing for Kotka as well, or at least the glamour he wore. An over-the-top LMOPQRGBT? However many letters, the alphabet that currently applied to the PC lexicon. He sported a day-glow yellow long-sleeved tee with a rainbow stripe from the shoulder to hip, tight orange yoga pants, his own, naturally purple hair, and an outlandishly intricate layer of piercings and jewelry. You get the picture. Technicolor nightmare of garishness. It was Siobhan's way of being obnoxious to her mother while pretending to be a decent person who wanted to save her friend. I caught a slight shiver and suddenly felt that I was no longer alone in the yard. There was a presence. My heart leaped into my throat and pounded. What the foob? I cut off when I saw that it was Tom Tildrum. He sat and stared up at me with that inscrutable manner of felines. Then he smirked. No other word for it outside of the thesaurus. Great job, Tom. Do you have to keep trying to give me a heart attack? I wasn't sure why I spoke to him as though he understood, but it seemed natural to do so with this particular specimen of nefarious feline. Then he told me why I was so inclined. That's what we do, Cal Rob. Cat humor. You wouldn't understand. He spoke. Well, I heard and understood his words. It wasn't like his muzzle was adapted for human speech, but the words reached my ears via regularish sound waves. It's a gift, he continued. Twice each year we get to communicate in this way. You may as well have a seat. The girls will take care of their parts, and we males have nothing to do until later, except have a short chat. He licked his paw, then sprang over to stand back-arched beside a nearby lounger on the back deck. I took my place in the lounger, and after a short spring, he made himself comfortable as he sprawled across my shins and feet. He was lighter than I'd imagined, considering his apparent size and bulk. There are some things that the Goslings simply don't know about you, and far more that you don't know about them. I know, because it's part of who I am, especially as part of the royalty of Otherworld Fae. I eyed him suspiciously. So you actually do understand when we talk, I said, as though it was some great revelation. His eyes squinted for a moment, mild annoyance, as if I understood cat kinsology. Of course, I'm hardly an imbecile, just because my vocal apparati are not designed or accustomed to human languages, except for the smattering of ancient Egyptian. Now, to more important matters. As a reigning monarch, I have other responsibilities and communications to make while the opportunity lasts, so no more interruptions. I nodded silent agreement, and he continued, a satisfied expression on his furry little puss. I had to cackle internally. I read that word used for face in some old novel, maybe heard it in an old movie. Oops, he was talking again, inner headshake of wonder on my part. You have studied lore and have visited Otherworld a few times. You've even had Fae provide training and instruction. However, that had mostly to do with skill and some basic knowledge. There is more to learn, so pay attention. He dug his front claws into my leg, just shy of drawing blood. I paid attention. You are starting to see that the world around you is overlain with Otherworld. They occupy the same space in some ways, and are totally separate in others. The city was built over a pristine forest with meadows, lakes, and streams. Several mounds or rounded hills in Mundania, yet it overlaps a population center in Otherworld. You might recall that there are still hills and rises, though many have been plowed over to level the land for building. Otherworld connects closely to Mundania all over this area. Many locales have become portals or vestibules for beings to travel in either direction. You've witnessed the way Otherworld beings seem to pop into and out of existence in Mundania, or to occupy spaces that seem much too small. The bridge troll is an excellent example. You saw the darkness behind him. That was his cave, his dwelling place, another world. He was fortunate that the opening to his lair ended up under a bridge. Plenty of prey, and trolls do prefer things dank. I digress. In any case, as you learn to see more completely, you will note that the city's vistas will often be overlain by images of otherworld places of import. Species in both realms are drawn to the same location. You'll have to see for yourself. What was your impression of the big man you've now met a few times? I thought for a moment. I sometimes felt like silly, but like I was talking with the big bad wolf. He possessed a wild, lupine quality. I shrugged and hoped that I'd been clear enough for the oversized kitty to comprehend my impressions. I didn't tell him that the big man even smelled of wolf. I wasn't sure how I even knew that. Mac tir mor, in one of your Mundanian tongues. Sound familiar? I know I can be obtuse at times, but I wasn't actually stupid. Like McIntyre, with more on the end. I managed to avoid adding an upward inflection as though it was a question. I knew I'd made the correct connection. I recalled that the name was associated with wolves. I get that part, but what does Moor mean? He grinned. Big, large, or great, depending on the context. You actually were, at least by cognomen, speaking with the big, bad wolf. It was my turn to grin. Thank you. I've always felt like we had some connection. Wolves and coyotes, I suppose. A big critter and a smaller one. Though I was almost as tall as him, just not as broad. Tom nodded sagaciously. You are still young. You come from a long-lived, slow-growing people. I must leave it for him to tell you any further details. But suffice it to say that you may trust him as far as you can, any Fae. He has taken a positive interest in you, and that bodes well for your chances at surviving. Now the most important part of what I must tell you. You recall the concept of the Geas. He did not wait for me to acknowledge that I did. He knew. There are 3 placed upon you, a typical number, and it is common for Fae folk to have these rules that apply specifically to them. In addition to other rules of the world, these individual rules, Geas, are stronger than any law or practice of this world. You must adhere to them or face disaster, up to and including your physical demise. I had to admit that he had my undivided attention. Stay within the guidelines of your Geas, and you have a chance of living a long life. 1. Enter an occupied residence only when invited by one or more of its occupants. 2. Never eat the flesh of a cat or catkin, nor drink its blood. 3. Once you start a quest, you must complete it, despite any delays or the seeming futility of the objective. Now, I have to go. I have pressing business, elsewhere. Before I could speak, and while I was in the early stages of reacting by sitting upright, he was gone. In that black swirly way he had. Foobar, I thought. Now I have laws that I must follow. Oh, what a snafu. We managed to make it through the holiday without starting World War III or whatever one were on these days. I stayed outside after Tom had left or whatever he did with that swirly thing. I noticed some brightly caparisoned folk who scampered out to the lakeside by crossing the Gosling lawn or the roadway out front, and I saw by the orange-yellow glow beyond the trees that someone had lit a large bonfire. I heard shouts and revelry and music set to a frantic pace, accompanied by cheers and applause. Wonderful, I thought. Some nosy, rich neighbor will probably call out the fire brigade. When I asked Sorsha about it, her eyes widened in surprise. Why, Rob, I'm sure there were a few costumes, but those people weren't all locals. This is one of the 2 times per year that Otherworld and Mundanes are more open to one another, and for a brief time, there are far more portals. Let's hurry so we can catch the bonfire dance. I shrugged. You grew up on this stuff, but I'm still getting used to it. I doubt I would have seen anything a year ago. And I wasn't even wearing the headband, so I must be improving. We held hands and hurried down to the shore. Siobhan and Kortka followed at a little distance. Neither had spoken to me more than was necessary for the purpose of the most basic decorum, and then only in the presence of Miss Ellie. Sorsha told me that their excuse to Miss Ellie was they didn't approve of me living in the house now that Sorsha and I were an item. Siobhan had her mother convinced that she was every bit the good Catholic girl that her mother was. She was a prevaricator of exceptional talent, and my practiced mendacity, excellent though it was amateur by comparison. When we reached a point where we could see the activity around the fires, I registered. There were 2 of them. I could make out the figures as they leapt and danced. Each worked his, her, or its way around the outer part of a loose circle of others and then made a run between the very smoky fires. Each shouted a phrase as he passed between the flames, and many dropped items onto one blazing pile or the other. I glanced at Sorsha. I loved her, but she was definitely weird, and now she had me participating directly in the weirdness. I immediately forgave her. No one could look at that profile and hold a grudge. Besides, I'd been to Otherworld and was some sort of fae myself. If that wasn't weird, nothing was. Couldn't be a hypocrite. Lying is fine, especially when there's a goal to it. But hypocrisy didn't sit right with me. She squeezed my hand. Stay close and watch. When it's your turn, pass between the blazes and cast-offs, whatever burdens you may be carrying internally, by shouting it into the smoke and fire. In the old days, the smoke was used to clean parasites from the hides of cattle before the people drove them to high pastures. It's mostly created by sage and other spices. We use them to cleanse the encumbrance from our minds, bodies, and souls. You can make as many as 3 trips, but you always have to fall back into the line of dancers and await your next turn patiently. If you have a physical talisman, you may cast them into the fires. Many people use bones, an old tradition. I hadn't told her about the conversation I'd had with Tom. I figured that she likely knew all about his abilities. Yet at the moment, the only burdens I felt were the 3 geas of which I had been so recently apprised. I was worried that I'd inadvertently break them or be tricked into doing so. With that, I watched as Siobhan and Kortka worked their way into the dance. It was the first time I'd witnessed either of them look happy. No, joyous. No, elated, full of ecstasy. There was no way a happy Siobhan could bode well for me. I did my part and soon lost myself in the frenetic pace of the dance and the wild strains of the music. By the time I'd completed my 3 runs, I felt exhausted. I could have physically maintained the pace of the dance for a while, but each time I passed through the smoke and fire, I felt a little more drained, as though I'd taken on a load instead of relieving one. So, Sorsha, I feel like I've just made a Spartan run, I thought this ritual was intended to make the mind, body, and soul lighter." She smiled wearily, tired in her own right. "That feeling will pass with the sunrise, and you'll feel refreshed. You must have had some pretty heavy concerns. The weightier they are, the greater the cost of removing them. Dawn of Beltane morning is fast approaching. Time to dance the maypole." I looked back towards the city and saw the sickly, urine-hued lights that washed out at the natural beauty from the sky had indeed started to lose luster, with the faintest hints of Solar Invictus, Sunna, Bel arising. I realized we must have been dancing for hours. My sense of time had definitely altered. I noticed that while I looked back towards the city, Sorsha looked longingly towards the lake. "Much prettier view, and with you in it, it's perfect." I know it was a lame line, but sometimes a little dorkish charm can disarm a maiden and reassure her that her man is not overly intent on getting what he wants. She gave a last wistful look and turned back to face me. I liked it when she did that. Oh, that face. I feel drawn to the water. I always have. No, as much as Dad, him being a Selkie and all. Still, I'm stronger in the water. You recall the fight with Siobhan. We are usually more evenly matched, but with my feet in water, I was stronger than usual. She does better with fire. In his last days, Dad explained that each of us had the strongest element attached to our being, our Ka. I think yours is either earth or maybe air. Hard to tell with you. I recalled the admonition of the big man that I should avoid water until I'd learned to make it an ally. Food for thought, but I had a question. So, I've read about Selkies, people who can turn into seals. Were seals? She laughed with that tinkling note she had. Yes, sort of. It was already Dad's nature for as long as I can recall. The way he told it, he took a serious wound and was on the brink of death. He happened to be in water and transformed for the first time. I think had he been completely fey, he would have likely have been able to do it. So from adolescence forward. Anyway, from then on, once a month, he'd slip off to the lake or beach, the nearest large body of water, and metamorphose. I remember him leaving for a few days each month, and never thought about why. He was a military dad, so he expected strange absences. She laughed again. When he told me, I simply had to ask. So, Dad, if you can turn into a seal, why didn't you join the Navy Special Forces? I didn't get any further. He'd shaken his head and said, You know how much I love puns, but some things are just too on the nose. I smiled at the memory she'd chosen to share. It would have been fun to be a SEAL. SEAL, definite advantages. Especially on the in-the-water training. I squeezed her hand a little. I've decided against joining a military branch. It seemed like a good way to go before I discovered what I am. I was copying Mr. G, and that was a good plan. But I just don't think I would fit. Besides, they could never pay me enough to support the lifestyle to which I've become accustomed. You know, poor and at the mercy of foster parents and government and gangsters. She squeezed back. I agree. You'd be a terrible soldier. I'm sure I must have given off a hurt vibe. Oh, don't get me wrong, Rob. You're the brightest person I've met outside of Dad. You possess the self-discipline, and the skills would be easy for you to master. Yet soldiers have to follow some silly rules. You'd have no patience for that. You'd get bored quickly and could never enjoy working around with a gaggle of young dilettantes. Dad was able only because he pitied them and wanted to help them do better. She stopped walking and I stopped with her, and we smoothly turned to face one another. Our moves always seemed to coincide that way, like a dance. You are, however, a warrior. With the barest of training, you've managed to take on the wild hunt, a bridge troll, and several other denizens of Otherworld. You may be other things as well. Time will tell. With that, we spent some personal time, none of your business, before we resumed our journey. We soon arrived in a clearing in the woods, near the lake at an overlook that was surprisingly clear of the large homes that dotted the region. We'd basically got through the trees and turned along a neck of land that rose above the clear waters that rippled in the morning breeze. There was a large pole erected in the center of the clearing. Apparently it was the maypole. Bright ribbons descended from the top of the pole and swayed in the breeze from off the lake. The top of the pole seemed a little bulbous, as though the earth had grown an appendage and was excited about it. Perhaps being a pagan heathen would be fun, I decided. The eerie music began again, and this time I saw the musicians, perched just a short way inside the tree line. Wee folk, in dun and brownish clothing with sprays of green in varying shades. All in all, like camouflage, yet now they chose to be seen. They appeared as though they'd been comparioned in bright, colorful hues. Their faces were open and pleasant, and they really seemed to enjoy what they did. I'd been living too long among knuckle-draggers to have heard much actual music. Plenty of beat and rhythm and urban noise. But once I'd heard otherworld music, I was spoiled for anything else. The melodies could cause one to be hypnotized, enthralled in a moment, chasing notes around the trees and over the horizon. My reverie faded, and I found myself holding fast to a ring at the end of one of the long ribbons. Sorcia stood to one side and Siobhan on the other. She was smiling again, though not in ecstasy, but rather in that way that cartoonish villains do when they think they've won. I didn't have time to consider what triumph she's clearly celebrated. The dance had begun. It was lively, though not as frantic as the bonfire dance. It started stately and slow, the dancers intertwining the ribbons as they passed, weaving around one another, men in one direction, women in the other, in and out, always weaving the ribbons and wrapping the pole. The pole was soon ensconced top to bottom in intertwining bright colors. I was once more lost in the music and in the steps of the dance, when shouts impinged on my hearing, and I watched the bright light of the day fade quickly into a dim shadow under heavy black clouds that billowed and swirled unnaturally to create a gloom that was as dark as night, as though Iberus himself had descended upon the gathering. The raised joyous voices soon turned to screams as the revelers scattered into the trees. I sought out Sorcia and drew my short sword and claw blade. We stood back to back, natural allies in a fight as well as in more enjoyable pursuits. Against the falling darkness, a set of figures of pure black stormed from the trees, beings with rectangular bodies and spiky heads. Their limbs were long and thin, yet somehow they appeared to be strong, if a bit angular. They carried short spears and forks and sported tails that ended in spikes like the tips of broadhead hunting arrows, and that lashed about like those demented monkeys. They leaped down from the branches above, often onto the heads and shoulders of unfortunate dancers. The Donnybrook had ensued, and I soon found myself facing off with several of the little monsters. They stood only about 3 feet tall, but I soon found that they were no mean adversaries. They were fast and knew how to use their height, or lack thereof, to advantage against tall opponents. I wanted to check on Sorcia. I could feel the heat of her against my back, yet I dared not turn nor even take a moment to speak. I was sorely pressed, just fending off the points and edges of the javelins being thrust towards me, each at a different angle all at once. 2 of the creatures would attack, then dance aside as the other 2 attempted to strike. All the while they capered and laughed and lashed their tails. Then one of the tails struck me in the leg. It caused intense pain and burning, like the thing was a type of scorpion. It was yet another threat I was already pressed to fend off the spear tips. I heard a deep, throated shout come from just inside the woods. It was followed by a bass singing chant. Shortly, the members of the band appeared, each armed with some sort of implement of war, and each implement resembling some agricultural tool. For all their disciplined ranks, they carried a variety of weapons that was staggering. They presently cut a swath through the dusky party crashers. I fought on as hard as I could, and by sheer luck I managed to slash one of the creatures across the eyes. It screamed and backed away, clutching its face. Fortunately, it careened into one of the others, who had been awaiting its next sally. This meant that I had to face only one antagonist for a brief instant. I knocked aside the javelin point and stepped forward to drive the sword into the rectangle of a body. The thing let out a piercing shriek that hurt my ears almost as much as the landing of its tail when it struck the back of my thigh and the monster shrank into itself. It soon left a desiccated carcass, like a twisted limb of black wood in which the tip of my blade was wedged. Unfortunately, the other two healthy monsters took that moment to renew their attack. It was even more difficult to fend off their thrusts, with the weight of their dead companion pinioned at the tip of my blade. I managed to use the extra mass of material as an awkward shield, but I would need to counterattack or end up skewered. I dropped my larger blade onto the face of one of the goblins and managed to seize the haft of its javelin. The gaping grin on the horrid face soon had a gaping counterpart where its throat had been, courtesy of my claw. I kicked out to one side and struck the last of my harassers. He bent double, and I used the side of my fist to bash in the back of his head. It dented inwards the way aluminum might crumple. I had slashed the other one's throat quickly, and my knife was still free, but apparently crushing the backs of their skulls was equally fatal, so there was no need. The dying creatures immediately crumpled and dried up into blackened tree limbs. The ones I'd blinded still screeched as it ran around the clearing, adding to the chaos. One of the band members soon put a stop to the noise, and another blackened limb joined the rest on the floor of the woodland clearing. I turned to check on my Sorcia and found that she was gone. I called out for her as I pried my sword from the twisted lump that had been a homicidal beast a short time earlier. The thing felt like dried licorice and gave me a fight. As I struggled, I continued to look around and call for Sorcia. I saw that at least 2 dancers lay on the ground, forever stilled, their tunes faded. They must have been otherworlders, since they each now disintegrated rapidly. Not Sorcia, I exclaimed in relief. I hadn't realized that I'd stopped breathing for a moment when I saw the bodies. There were several wounded, being tended to by friends or by the wee folk from the band. Presently, one of those approached me, stopped, and looked up into my eyes. "Greetings, warrior. I am called Roar. We noted that you destroyed 4 of the Hutah, the goblin folk. It was well fought. Not many so young could have taken on that many and lived. You are clearly wounded and distressed. How may we help?" A scene from an old movie flashed into my mind. A character in a space opera mumbled, "Short help is better than no help." I realized when he mentioned wounds that each of my legs had taken stings, and blood seeped from a small puncture on the right side of my waist and from the top of my left thigh. Both legs felt as though they were on fire and were growing stiff and weak. I nodded, which added a new sensation. Vertiginous waves. The being assumed a grave look. "Best that you take a seat. Our medic will see to you presently. In the meantime, drink this." He handed me a tiny flask, which I assumed contained some type of spirit. I was right. It burned going down, but then I felt a warmth replace the cold that had begun to seep from the sting sights. I sat, more heavily than I had since I'd first learned to walk. After the fight, during my subsequent short search for Sorsha, I'd wandered near a tree, which now provided a welcome backstory, so that I didn't tumble backwards. Thank you, I managed as I returned the now empty flask. Funny, I thought. I know I drained it, but I swear I felt liquid swashing as he took it from my hand. Oy vey. Did you by any chance see my girlfriend, the stunning red-haired young lady? Roar shook his head. No, like you, we were busy. It's odd that a Hu Tao attacked during the day and on this holiday. We were most surprised of any. They are our ancient foe. Here comes the medic. Try to rest easy while she checks you. In the meantime, know that you are now a gnome friend. With that, he reached out, and with little axe he held and brushed my left cheek in an odd swirling pattern. I'd flinched a little at the last moment, but now the spot felt warm and golden, somehow golden. He nodded and walked away to check on the rest of his little crew. By then the medic had arrived. She was similar in appearance to Roar, but with a feminine look and bearing. No brightly colored beard, for one thing. I am called Freda. I am practiced at the types of wounds you've taken. They can become serious if not treated. I see that Roar provided you with some antivenom. You have that certain twinkle in your eye and the rosy hue in your cheeks, and the glyph on your cheek of gnome friend. She gave a shallow bow and a deep nod all at once. She administered a different potion and applied unguents and assured me that they would counteract the stings and allow my body to expel the venom with no lasting damage. She cleaned and bandaged the puncture wounds and warned me that I would be sick for a few days because the javelin points had been poisoned. She was amazed that I was still conscious. But I had a mission. I had to find Sorsha. I looked around blearily while Freda completed her poultice and bandaging. Where was Siobhan and Kotka? I wondered. Those two had apparently disappeared along with my ladylove. I had expected to find them standing around and smirking at me, but they were nowhere in sight. Likely they'd fled, but maybe they'd taken Sorsha. Anger roiled within me, and I rose precipitously and stormed out into the forest. Only I didn't, at least beyond my fevered imagining. The long, dark tunnel of unconsciousness beckoned, and I helplessly entered and ran forward into its oblivious depths. The Urban Fae, The Geas, Part 2, by Michael Lockhart. When I awakened, I was comfortable and felt not a care in the world. I was unsure in which world I rested so contently, but I felt good physically, though some troubled thoughts gnawed at the edges of my mind. Sorsha, where was she? I raised up from my bed and immediately slammed my head into the low ceiling above, even as I cried out for her. I lay back, now with a new soreness in my forehead, and heard voices. It seems our guest is awake, and none too soon, my lord. It was a deep voice, from a small form, one of the gnome folk. Thank you, Scarde. If you don't mind, I'd like to speak with him immediately. That basso profundo was familiar. The big man. Apparently he was some big shot in the other world, with that milord title. I suspected he was after I'd trained at his little fort. Besides, he had a certain bearing. A third voice intruded. Freda. You may, but you must let him rest for at least the remainder of today. The venom and poison are gone, but he needs time to regain his strength. I could hear some slight amusement, though no mockery in the big man's tone. I shall be brief, medic. We all need him to recover fully. Presently, the door to my half-sized chamber opened. Enough light now reached me that I could see that I had not bumped my head on the ceiling, but just the top of an enclosed bed. Chamber, I suppose. A bed in a box, and I was jacked, in the language of my captors. Saviors? I guess that I'd soon know for sure. I wasn't truly confident in the positive intentions of the big man, nor any other denizens of the other world. The light was briefly occluded when a large, stooped figure entered the room. The big man quickly took a seat on a bench that would have accommodated 2 or 3 of the gnome folk. "So, Coyote, you didn't rest long. However, you have made an excellent warrior, and I understand that you have been designated a gnome friend. Impressive. Now we will get you well and back on your feet, so that you can assume your quest to find your lost love." Very romantic. Ah, there's the slightly mocking tone, I assured myself. I was feeling a little grumpy. I had no intentions of abiding by the medic's advice. I glared. I don't suppose anyone else has taken up the hunt for her while I was out for I don't know how long. He sat silently for a moment. He clearly disliked my tone and implications. "You have been out for a day and a night, and you will rest and eat until tomorrow morning. Then we will pick up the search wherever it has led my minions to this point." I hung my head. I apologize for my tone. I feel out of sorts, but no reason to get a bad attitude with you, sir. He nodded. "Good enough. My trackers and hounds have searched the area around the dance. Sorsha was taken to the shore of the lake, where the trail would disappear for most. But I was able to enlist the aid of lake dwellers who can track through water. The trail ended at a portal. She was taken to one of the dark realms of the otherworld. Don't worry, you are already in otherworld, and we are near enough to that dark realm. When you recover, I'll expect to see you ready for our mission." He reached inside his voluminous cloak and pulled out my case. "You'll be needing the items within. You really must do a better job of keeping up with your toys." I was restless and seethed, but I forced myself to take it easy and eat the fine fare offered by Frida and her husband, Skarda. Apparently the gnome folk like to eat hearty dishes. She supplied a stew of chunky meat and vegetables. After the first bite, I looked up in amazement. "Dr. Frida, these are the best-tasting vegetables I've ever eaten. I've never imagined such rich taste from them. I always ate them because they were nutritious. I never thought I'd enjoy. No, adore them." Frida's habitual smile widened even further. "Why, thank you, Wolfling. Oh, and don't worry about eating on this side. Since you're Fae, that rule only applies when certain spells have been cast on the repast." I swallowed the bite I'd been chewing, along with the lump that had sprung in my throat. Once again, I'd forgotten the rules of Otherworld. The consequences could be immediate, unlike in Mundania. Now I had here even more binding laws pressing upon me. Mundane military service was looking like less of a burden. I assumed that Wolfling was the name they used for Coyote. I liked it. Made it sound like I was somewhere in the same league with the Mac Tirmor, or at least playing the same sport. It sounded more dignified, I suppose, though I knew that among First Nation peoples, Coyote was the trickster god, and I felt that role applied to me as well. However, I'd become more and more forthright and less felonious in the past half year. Perhaps I was evolving from one sobriquet to another. Besides, that Coyote would likely be a major player here in Otherworld. He might not like me borrowing his name. I enjoyed visiting with Frida and Skarda that day and learned about the gnomish realm, at least that of the Lichtgnomen. They spoke only a little of the Darkgnomen, the language of their dichotomous kin. Otherworld seemed to have many diametrically opposed realms and folks to inhabit them. They were horrified that I offered to compensate them for their hospitality. Apparently, it was an honor for them to host a gnome friend. It seems that the Roar was a gnome lord or something, and the fact that he designated me and marked me made it a great prestige. Funny, a gnomish prince leading a band through his voice was much deeper than the singing prince in Mundania, and his band played instruments rather than computer-generated keyboardish stuff. The next morning I opened my case and found not only my usual store of items, but a set of clothes. I recalled that on my last visit the big man had mentioned placing some clothes in the case. There were some loose-fitting, predominantly dark green plaid trousers and a kilt. I selected the trousers. I soon found a pair of wingdings, and Skarda supplied that they were for wrapping the lower legs to keep the legs of the breeches from flopping about. There were a couple of tunics, and I selected a dark blue one with nice embroidery around the keyhole neck and the close-fitting cuffs on the sleeves. It seemed that since the fire had removed the outer covering from my case, the interior of it had expanded considerably. I found that a deer-hide bag from inside the case hung comfortably around my shoulder, and in turn held the case with all my goods, though it felt like it held only a small amount. I donned all of my otherworld gear. The bowler didn't fit well in the current environment, and Frida assured me that the diadem was unisex. So once I was fully dressed and adorned, I stooped and stepped out from the home of my hostess and host into the early morning sunrise in Otherworld. Mac Tirmor literally rolled up on a chariot of all things, drawn by the most perfect horses I could imagine. A short, stocky man in trousers and tunic drove the chariot. For the first time I saw my new best friend without the cloak and hood. He was resplendent in a kilt that matched the one in my case. His dark green tunic was tucked inside, and he wore both a heavy golden torque and a silver diadem that held back his flowing hair, several shades lighter than my own, except for that and the mustachio that was long and braided at each side of his mouth. He looked like a slightly older version of me. I must have projected the confusion I felt. He offered a fearsome grin that showed his bright, largest teeth. "Good morning, Wolfling. I hope you are ready to take a ride with Grandpa." I finally understood. He'd taken my side, however begrudgingly, due to family obligations. Yet where had he been all those years I was stranded in Mundania with the various Fosters? I could have been here, learning about my true heritage, learning how to deal with the other world. He used his mind-reading trick to decipher my rushing thoughts that verged on outrage. "You will learn the whys and wherefores soon enough. For now, trust that there was a purpose greater than your individual feelings at work. In the meantime, I brought you a pony to assuage your hurt feelings." He swept his massive arm with an open hand towards a sturdily built horse that followed along behind the chariot. No ropes or halters bound it, and it wore only a blanket in a tartan that matched my trousers, across the withers by way of the saddle. The coat was midnight black, and the neck arched magnificently. The mane was long and silky, and there were tufts of hair around the fetlocks. The horse raised its chin and flicked it towards me in greeting, the way Limongello used to greet me. I was soon astride the steed and trotting along beside my grandpa, the Mac Tirmor, on his chariot. He introduced his driver as Gear, It sounded like a growl, fitting for the servant of a wolf clan lord. He tutored me on what to expect in the dark realm we approached. One of many, he assured me. Your lady will be held near water, since that's how she was taken. Not sure what being or beings took her from the Hutao. It was a real trick, though. They led our trackers on a merry chase, and it ended by looping back to the lake. The Hutao would have carried her through the trees, from limb to limb, truly a green and growing highway for their ilk. Of course, the party that put them up to it may have moved her again by now, or ransomed her to a different being. He glanced at my blanched features. I don't mean to distress you, wolfling. I simply wish to convey what all difficulties may be involved in finding her. I kept my peace and worried internally, all the while attempting to hide my distress from my grandfather. Grandfather! All this time! I couldn't help but fume a little. I hoped that I hid it as well as I thought I did. For all the resentment I felt towards this man, I was impressed by him, and desperately wished to impress him in turn. Grandfather, I've never ridden a horse before today. I thought it would be harder. I've always seen riders use reins and stirrups, but this horse seems to know where to go. The big man looked over at me. Although the chariot platform was low to the ground, he stood rather than sat, and was tall in the bargain, so we were mostly on level, despite the height of my mount. He does. Remember where you are, Rob. Horses here are intelligent creatures, even this one who likes to loaf in mundania and watch television, then emulate the gestures of mortals. He's an odd one, but he's stronger and faster than any other I could find. A noble mount, despite his odd predilections. My noble mount whickered in a horsey laughter, followed by a snort. He trotted a few steps with his feet raised higher than usual. A parade trot. We traveled for an indeterminate time, and it seemed that rather suddenly the sun was low in the sky and evening rapidly approached. We neared a settlement, a log fort on a hill, with several moats and terraced fortifications. Dun Amras, my grandfather rumbled. It overlooks and guards this passage and crossroads. I looked at him. From beings from the dark realm? He shook his head. Not exactly. It guards the way in either direction, as well as guarding a portal. We will stop here for the night and ensure that our crossing is known to the Crossroad Guardian. We must be cautious. The Crossroad Guardian is easily offended. Show him courtesy and he will treat us well enough. The food and drink will be safe to consume. At least I believe it will, and I have ways to check, so follow my lead. The road that led to the fort was winding, and the gates at each level were offset, so that one had to pass, follow the narrow way to the next gate, then climb towards it. Eventually, we reached the apex gate, and as he had at each of the others, Mac Tirmor announced himself. He never introduced me. I rode in silence behind him and kept my mouth shut while my other senses searched for danger. I'd begun to notice smells and sounds, more than I once had. Wolfling indeed, I thought. The place did not feel hostile, nor did the regular guardians appear to be unfriendly. They were all business. They wore light armor and carried long spears. They seemed to be normal enough-looking men and women. At least they weren't creepy like so many beings in Otherworld. I soon found out that none of them was the Crossroads Guardian. We entered the hall of Dun Amras, and were shortly ushered into the presence of his nibs. Geas had stayed behind to ensure that the horses were properly attended, so it was just Grandpa and me. I was still getting used to having a grandfather. I'd realized that he had to be paternal, since I'd seen my maternal one at my parents' funeral, and while he'd been tall, he was not the ridiculous mass of muscles beside whom I approached the dais in the center of the circular hall. Dad had been pretty much large and muscular, too, now that I thought of it. He had slightly darker hair, but now that I looked, there was a definite resemblance. I briefly hoped that I would reach similar proportions as I matured. Not an ounce of fat on this dude. He was like chiseled marble. I was looking ahead and wondered where the crossroads guardian might be. The only occupant of the dais was an enormous hound, like something from the hunt. It lay across the front of the dais, tongue lolling and drool dripping like any pooch. The big bad wolf halted before the hound on the dais. "Greetings, crossroads guardian of Dun Amras. We humbly ask for guest rights and for passage into the next realm." The hound stared for a moment, then licked its vast chops. A voice sounded, much the way it had emanated from Tom Tildrum. "Granted, Mac Tirmore. You and your cub may sup with us tonight, rest in our hostelry, and breakfast in the morning. Your beasts shall be stabled and receive care. You may enter the next realm so long as you intend no action that will lead to outright war." The Mac Tirmore inclined his head. "I can promise that we will do nothing more than retrieve a member of our family. Any precipitous actions have already been taken by other parties. But we intend only to take what is ours, and have brought no armies." The hound seemed satisfied. "You know the price of this hostelry. You may attend the evening meal in the guest hall once you are refreshed, or eat at the hostelry. If you choose the hall, be ready to provide news and entertainment." We left the presence, and I stalked along beside my new-found closest relative. I didn't like that dog. It seemed arrogant to me. Then, as I considered, I realized that it was simply a canid mind at work, very practical and direct in thought and communication. No pleasantries, not unlike a certain coyote. Once upon a time in another world. Grandfather pointed out the guest hall with the hostelries beside it that contained sleeping quarters, and we headed in that direction. "We'll go claim our space in the hostelry. We may venture to the guest hall, but we are looking to find information rather than supply it. So it may be best to simply remain in our quarters." I nodded and turned my steps towards the hostelry. Before he could stop me, I'd banged my head thoughtlessly and ignored my geish. I'd never thought of a no-tell motel as a residence. The big bad wolf assumed a stern grimace, and I realized that I had foobarred the situation. "The law of hospitality is forfeit," he rumbled quietly. "Our sojourn here will be fraught with more peril, thanks to your heedlessness." I couldn't even argue. I simply nodded and apologized. Since I was at fault, I volunteered to take the first and the final watches. Had it not been for me, we could have slept in peace. Grandfather would likely have set me on those watches anyway, so I might as well present myself as contrite. Besides, I knew I'd struggled to sleep since I was an open target and very preoccupied with worry for Sorsha. The guest hall would have to wait for another visit, just as well. Everyone else could use the rest. There were several other parties in the dormitory-style building, each separated by a pair of wicker screens, and all set around a central fire pit. There were no doors, just woven hangings that covered the entrance to each section. Yet the interior of our stall was quiet, and I could hear no sounds from other sections when the curtains were closed. The interior walls could be shifted to accommodate larger and smaller groups of visitors. I wasn't sure if they shifted on their own or some unseen hand moved them, but ours seemed fit to accommodate the three of us. I opened our curtains since we had decided to eat in the hostelry, and the food was placed at the center hearth. Imagine my surprise, chagrin, and fury when I saw that the curtain for the space across from ours was already opened, and there perched Siobhan on a pile of pillows, while Kotka stood at the curtain, bowls in hand, prepared to retrieve fruit from the common pot. He stood there in his natural felinoid form, in a vest hung with pouches, a belt, and festoon with almost as much jewelry as he had worn when he'd posted in the Glamour. "What the foobar is this?" I inquired of my companions. Grandpa looked over at the two outlaws and grinned ferociously at them, all of his teeth showing and a snarl threatening to overwhelm any fallacious charms of which the grin might hint. "As I told you, folk from any realm or province may stay at the hostelry. However, it is allowed that we may apprehend criminals when we are in hot pursuit." Siobhan remained inclined on her pillows and purred, outwardly calm. "What criminals could you possibly mean? Woof, woof." She had clearly intended to insult my grandfather, and maybe it made him angrier, but it was hard to tell, since he had already been pretty outraged, and his features were flushed scarlet. Kotka looked nonplussed, unsure of whether to fill the bowls or scat in terror. I loosened my blades and mentally encouraged him to flee, or better yet, attack, so that I could kill him without worry over laws of hospitality. Unfortunately, he decided to stand still rather than to tempt fate or Faye. The Mactirmore issued a growl from deep in his chest. "You kidnapped or facilitated the taking of your sister against her will. You took her from a celebration, and your minions are set upon the good folk at the dance." He never took a step, yet somehow he appeared to approach that arrogant being when he loomed. She tried to cover her reaction, but tiny beads of sweat broke out upon her upper lip. "Gotcha," I shouted in internal triumph. I had to give her credit for sheer nerve, though. She shrugged. "Why would I have to kidnap my own sister? If I invited her, she would come with me anywhere. Am I not her loving sibling? Not to mention the oath that she and her pet scavenger elicited. My companion and I left the dance after we completed our passages. We were not there for any attack, did you say?" she purred, more cat-like than her familiar, who now looked nervously back and forth between his mistress and the Mactirmore. Apparently, I wasn't much of a threat. I had to agree. Between all the possibilities, I was probably the least dangerous option. Nor was Grandpa Wolf fooled. He probably smelled her fear. Did I? Her scent had changed. When did I catch her scent? Maybe there were nuances in my nature that had not yet come to full light. The rumbling growl from the chest of the big man repeated, "I cannot prove it for no. And we pursued those that laid hands on her until we lost the trail. But we shall be watching you, sly one. You overreach, despite whom your father was. You are not so beloved that you can avoid my wrath should I decide to destroy you. I smell your fear, and it shows that you have good sense in that regard at least. We wish to find your sister and make her safe. I am inclined to get information from you the fun way, but will not break law. He glanced at Geas, who stepped forward with bowls for himself and his master. I followed his example and filled my own ahead of Kotka, though he had been standing at the pot before us. It was a breach of courtesy, but not of law. Frankly, it was petty and spiteful, but I think we all wanted to precipitate a violent physical reaction that would allow us to respond rather than initiate the breach of the peace. Yet Kotka waited patiently, and after he'd filled the bowls, he darted into the flimsy chamber with his mistress and abruptly closed the hanging. The tension in my shoulders relaxed, though I hadn't realized it had built. We adjourned to our space and ate in silence. I mentally prepared for my watch and hoped that Siobhan didn't know about my geisha. She might break the laws of hospitality anyway, but she seemed frightened, a little unsure of herself, like she was swimming in waters that were deeper than she realized, until she could no longer sense the bottom. I chuckled. Fire spirits should not swim at all, regardless of the depth. My grandfather and his charioteer looked up at me, then at one another and smiled. Maybe I was starting to catch on to this Fey racket. Watch duty, even when there is a real possibility of attack, can get boring. It's just not our nature to sit around and focus entirely on potentialities, at least not for too long at a time. My mind strayed a little, and my thoughts remained in dangerous territory. This hostelry between realms, like crossroads, like the little hern house that had stood on the edge of the urban blight. Neither in nor out, just neutral, until I arrived on the scene, and that crossroads turned into crosshairs. Now the Hearn family and the Goslings had suffered greatly, all for befriending me. My new love, the first being for whom I'd held genuine feelings I'd had in years, was now in peril, possibly of her very life, all for being with me. I realized I was being self-centered. There may have been some purpose related to her or to someone else, but I wanted to wallow in pointless misery and guilt. From the paperback novels and old movies I've absorbed over the years, I expected that any trouble would come during my second watch, in the dark early witching hour. It came during my mental self-flagellations on first watch, while I was not exactly unalert, but maybe a little distracted. Okay, I wasn't paying attention. Made sense. It was the time when my companions would be sleeping deeply. I had, however, to set aside my admiration for the tactics of my enemies for the moment. The hanging was snatched away, and a dark, looming figure stood silhouetted against the cook fire. It was as large as the big bad wolf and clad in similar armor. I could not see the face, but the intent was clear, since it held a battle axe in its left hand. Now, I did not sit idle when the curtain parted so hastily. I reacted by rolling to one side, drawing my blades and assuming a fighting stance. The figure simply stood. It stared with blazing eyes that generated a sense of dread that led to anger. I unreasonably hated this creature who had dared disturb my mental pictures of her. Mac Tirmor and Geas had sprung from their pallets and risen with short weapons to account for the confined space. I did not spare them a glance, but kept my eyes on my opponent, and his gaze remained steadily upon my own. "Come fight, carrion eater," his voice grated. "You are less than a craven cur dog, a coward and of no consequence." Here was a game I understood. He wanted to goad me so that I'd make an unthinkable attack. His insults, well, a little old-fashioned, had raised my hackles. I already felt an unreasoning anger. Perhaps I had reasons to be angry, just not at him, yet. He changed tact. "You are weak and stupid. You will fail in your quest. Likely the girl has already found a more fitting mate. If not, perhaps I will seek her out and show her what a real man, a warrior rather than a mangy mutt, can do for her." That pushed my buttons, as he'd intended. But before I could surge forward, my grandfather barked out one word. "Hand!" It caused me to pause and regain a modicum of control. Then I saw the figure's right hand. It was red and dipped with blood. My earlier failure to recall the geas rose in my consciousness, and another prohibition came to my mind that I'd learned in my first vacation in Otherworld for training. Never fight a man with a red right hand. I pushed my weapons back into their scabbards and fastened them in place. I hadn't expected to be tested again so soon, but I was determined to do better than I had the first time, with the geas. This rule about the red right hand applied to all. The figure glared at my grandfather. "I am not here for you, old wolf, but one day I or another will come and you will face your doom." The being swirled like Tom Tildrum, his dark cloak a shadow in the flickering light of the hearth fire, and was gone. Mac Tir Mor eased out a breath. "That was too close, Rob. Make sure that you hold on to your temper. That being would have killed you, and there's nothing anyone could have done to protect you. No one wins against the Les Erg. The only escape is to avoid the fight. Once you engaged in battle with him, he will not stop until you are slain. So, you failed once and succeeded once tonight. I did not expect you to be tested again so soon." He exactly echoed my own thoughts. Others are aware of your restrictions, and those that apply to us all are common knowledge on this side. Sooner or later, they will find a way to trick you into breaking your geisha, or more general rule. At best, breaking the geisha will invite a further attack. This one was clever. It used your breaking of one prohibition to entice you towards breaking another. At worst, a geisha may bring harm in its own right. You are nearing adulthood, and you must be careful. You are good at the rules of Mundania. Now you must master those of your home world. Girr took the watch, and I settled down to try and rest and calm my nerves. Before my eyes closed, I looked through the hastily and poorly replaced hangings across the cubby where Siobhan and Kortka had been ensconced. The curtain was open, and they were gone from the hostel. Early the next morning we rose, and Gurr left to fetch the livestock. I still couldn't believe that I could ride a horse. Different than riding a bike, but kind of fun, like a living bike. I wondered if I could one day take my mount back and glamour him to look like a bike. I had to shake off the silly thought. I felt a moment's guilt for forgetting the seriousness of our quest. Now I'd gone and done it. First, It was wistful. Now it was a quest. I was in danger of becoming a nerd. Pretty soon I'd be looking at Grandpa Wolf as the dungeon master. We proceeded as the sun rose and cast her red eye across the landscape. I don't know what I'd expect when we'd entered the dark realm. Maybe shadows or clouds. Yet the change was more in feeling than in appearance, though the flora soon took on a more tropical appearance, and the temperature warmed considerably as we passed beyond the border. My mood shifted to dark and sought the very shadows I'd expected to visibly perceive. I sensed a heaviness, like a burden of spirit. Mac Timor assumed that grim look that he projected so effectively. Geas, never a particularly cheerful fellow, looked downright mournful. I thought tears would well at any moment. Even the horses seemed listless and plodded rather than trotted. The border was only sparsely settled, since the area would be susceptible to raids. Yet they might also be more easily raid the lands beyond, so the area held some residents. The Steedings and Rats, as MacTiermore named them, looked strong and forbidding. There were fields with folk working in them. Most looked human enough, but one could never be sure. Some were definitely beings of some other sort. All in all, it was a bucolic version of the mean streets. I simply needed to learn new street rules and get to know the major players, I assured myself. Easier to see things coming without so many buildings, I assured myself. As grim in mind as Grandpa was of face. I began to grow weary of this grimmality and broke the silence. Lord Wolf, what sort of place are we seeking, and what will we have to overcome to rescue Sorsha? My grandfather decided that it was an inquiry worthy of a response. We are headed to the Dun, the castle for this realm. All roads will lead to it, so we don't have to seek, only follow. As for what we will face, we will know when we face it. There will be some head-on challenges and some subtle ones. There are always both kinds among the Fae. We worry about specifics when they come to us. We don't do much planning in Otherworld. No point when every plan crumbles under the law of the Murphy. I had to smile at that. Even here, the rules of snafu and foobar were the most basic and powerful. So quoth this raven. The Urban Fae, the Geas, Part 3, by BearLair64, a.k.a. Michael Lockhart. Eventually we began to see more structures, and more of them approaching the verge of the lane we followed. As a result, I could see that most of the workers were indeed humans of some sort, not too prepossessing, and most would not look up at us. Other folk appeared in various forms, some anthropomorphic and others not. There was a definite reptilian theme, sinuous bodies attracting the eye and snatches of sibilant speech in an odd language tempered the ear. There were definitely some mini sauropods in the fields. I'd long lost any shock at weird creatures, but seeing wee dinosaurs pulling plows was a little amusing. The thoughts raised my spirits, though only briefly. Once more a question arose. Grandfather, I note that the folk in this realm tend towards reptilian, at least in appearance, yet those that attacked the circle at Beltane were different. They possessed a hint of avian character. Are they allies with one another or something else? I'd gotten over my reactions to calling a man grandfather who appeared to be in his early to mid-20s, not that much older than me. It helped that his eyes had a depth and a sorrow to them that spoke of a long life indeed. He turned to me with the faintest upward twitches at the corner of his mouth, in the otherwise grim features. I suspected that he liked the question. The realms tend towards one type of folk or another, though there are always captives, refugees, and a handful of immigrants from other places and worlds. Those that attacked the Beltane dance were called Hu Tao among themselves, and certain cultures in Mundania. They are often employed as mercenaries for raids. They are related to goblins of the darker variety. They can move through the forest by ways of the limbs and stems that interlace far above the floor of green spaces. They are fearsome, as you discovered, but not overtly brave, and they fight effectively only in packs. They have some avian qualities. You may have noted that they had feathers and down instead of fur or hair. Using them was intended to disguise the culprit, but you have already discovered the source of malice towards you. I looked at him in surprise. I did? I don't recall naming any suspects. His lips twitched upwards once more. You spoke in your fever. You gave the name Serpentina. Sobriquet for one of the chief servants of one of the major powers in Underworld. On that note, I'll remind you that coyote is already in use, so you will want to start thinking of yourself as Wolfling or Robert of the Wolf Clan. He probably wouldn't care much, after all. There are only so many names to be had. He might even find it amusing. But calling the name of a power may call that power. He's not one whom we wish to become entangled. Back to Serpentina on this side. He will have scales over his body, but his head is covered in blooms, dark red, and his scales are silver white. By face standards, he's considered quite handsome, yet likes to eat human flesh and drink their blood. It's in his nature, considering who his father is. That's always the real danger. We fight one another in this world, yet we must take care in what feuds we become entangled. A fight is between individuals, but a feud will entangle entire clans for generations. Our clan is very powerful, but not the strongest by far. I say that with no shame. Serpentine's clan has many adherents and descendants, and may once again be on the rise among mortals. I believe that we may have a slight advantage, but I'd never make assumptions. He grew quiet again as the top of a gleaming hill rose directly in our path. It was coppery gold in the noon sun. As we proceeded, the hill rose from the horizon, and the next step of it was more gold than red. The following was even more so. Steps, I realized. This was no hill. It was one of those American stepped pyramids. By the time we drew close enough to view the entire structure, there were 5 tiers visible. I'd seen pictures of something like this built near Mexico City in Mundania. That one had been all stone and charcoal gray, yet it had possessed much less foreboding than this gleaming but gloomy edifice. Despite it being used for human sacrifice, we had made no attempt at stealth, so I assumed we'd be starting with the direct approach. I shuddered with thoughts of sweet Sorsha being held captive in this pile of misery. She was so very strong, but something in me rebelled at the thought of my lady being held against her will. I found it repugnant, and I intended her succor. There I was having noble thoughts again. I was ruined for criminal enterprises. Or so I thought. As we approached the pyramid, soldiers in red, white, and gold armor appeared and lined the avenue. They carried big, flat wooden cricket bats with sharp chunks of volcanic glass attached to the edges. I would once have considered such Stone Age weaponry to be greatly inferior, but I'd learned that in the hands of an expert warrior, just about anything could be deadly. The troops simply lined the avenue and watched. A few carried spears and bows rather than the paddle swords, but they held them the way modern Mundania soldiers hold weapons when they drill. There were quite a few, more than the big bad wolf and I combined could take. I never actually seen him fight, but the odds were impossible, higher fey or not. We drew close to the base of the step structure before anyone challenged us. A tall figure, resplendent in gold armor, with a white cape at his shoulders and a headpiece crested in scarlet blooms, stepped in front of the entrance, a square hole in the direct center of the base. It appeared to be an insert porch with a door tucked beneath the shadows. Beside the tall chieftain stood another figure. At first I thought it was a man with a weird mask and a feathered cloak, but I quickly realized that it was some sort of anthropomorph avian being. I mentally shrugged. It was getting easier every moment to accept weird stuff. The chieftain spoke. "Greetings, Mac Tirmor. What brings you to the exalted residence of the most mighty son of the plumed serpent?" The big bad wolf drew himself to his full height, easier now that the chariot was no longer rolling. I sat as tall in the saddle as I could manage. I still thought it was weird how quickly I'd taken to horseback riding. It seemed as natural as walking to me. It helped that the mount was highly intelligent and well-trained. Grandfather spoke in loud but measured tones. "Greeting, chieftain of the Golden Gate. We seek audience with your master. We believe that he may have information for us about a lost comrade. Will you allow us entrance to treat with him, or shall we roast in the sun?" The chieftain smiled with unconcealed malice. "You will do as my master bids. You are fortunate, however, since he has recently returned from a foray abroad. He is in a receptive mood and perhaps will not keep you waiting long." About that time, the door of the pyramid swung open enough to allow a thin being to emerge. It approached the chieftain and spoke to him in a low voice. The chieftain nodded. "You are most fortunate. My lord will deign to speak with you. You will have to do without shade, unless you have brought your own. He comes shortly to the entrance." With a broader and even nastier smile, he stepped to one side, and the feathered parrot guy stepped to the other. The doors opened inside the gloom cast by the short tunnel of the portal to the pyramid doorway. A throne appeared, and the doors swung shut to provide a backdrop. Upon the throne sat a man, possibly a fae of similar type to our own. He was shockingly pale, and his hair, maybe feathers, was a red the color of dried blood. I couldn't clearly discern his features, but they seemed to bear a different cast than that of my clan folk. His eyes glittered from the darkness and pierced each of us in turn. He exuded malice and power, a being in his own realm and in his own ruling seat. Eventually his eyes settled on the old wolf. "It has been some time since our last meeting, Tyree. Despite the cause of that encounter, I give you greetings and courtesy. What would you have of me?" I noticed that his voice was higher pitched than I would have thought. It carried well, though with an odd quality, as though he favored the consonants and chewed his words before allowing them to pass his almost non-existent lips. I'd learned something new, my grandfather's given name. The Mac Timor was apparently accustomed to these drawn-out courtesies and word games. I fairly seethed with anger. I only wanted to see Sorsha and know that she was well. I managed to choke down an interruption. I knew that would be counterproductive, but holding my tongue at that moment was one of the most difficult tasks I'd ever endeavored to undertake. I chuckled internally, imagining myself clutching the tip of my tongue between my thumb and forefinger. I had to entertain myself when I was stressed. I almost missed Grandfather's retort. Chief Serpentine, one of my associates, has been taken against her will. Though she was only a minor member of an allied clan, she was under my protection, so I feel obligated to retrieve her. I thought that perhaps with your great wisdom, perhaps you might offer advice on her whereabouts. After all, your knowledge of the lands is extensive. That was almost too much. Flattery to this turd, this Sorsha napper? I choked back comments. I'm sure the apoplectic fury fairly shone in my features. The feathered-head scoundrel detected my scowl and the burning scarlet that had flushed my features. I got a glimmer of teeth. Maybe fangs. Perhaps a malignant grin and a few answering sparks in his eyes. I see your kinsman struggles to maintain courtesy, though he is very young and perhaps untutored in civilized manners. Mac Timor remained cool. He didn't even glance at me. He's learning rapidly, and his skills may surprise those who would meddle in various worlds. Now, as to the matter of my servant, she was taken at a Beltane dance in breach of custom and the bands of peace. Her captors took her by way of a water portal. By all indications, it exited at your lake. There was indeed a large body of water to one side of the pyramid. It was almost concealed by rainforest growth and the bulk of the gigantic structure, but appeared to be extensive, a lake rather than a pool or pond. Perhaps you or one of your people saw something useful? The last was clearly a statement rather than a question. Serpentine understood the implication. I will inquire. I certainly do not wish to have one of your folk loose in my lands, even involuntarily. I'm sure that she means no harm, but we have not been friends. And her captors clearly bear malice to both of us, since bringing her here would implicate me or mine in the plot. These are, after all, troubling times, as times always are in Otherworld. He was clearly dissembling and intended to cover his tracks, but I'd heard a key word, captors, rather than captor. I hoped that my grandpa had wolf ears to go with the other paraphernalia. The wolf mumbled, Indeed, those who took her fall under the law of hot pursuit. I cheered internally. Of course he'd picked up the verbal clue and thrown it back at Snaky Bird Boy. You are welcome to join our chase, but mostly I ask leave to continue it myself in your lands. Serpentine smiled in that cold manner of his. I saw no flame on your spear. I heard not the ringing of your herald horns. So it appears you have failed to follow the rules of the law of hot pursuit. However, I will take you at your word and treat your approach as a visit rather than a challenge. You will never have leave to freely roam my lands, any more than you would allow me to rove yours. I have informed you that the kidnappers fall under my concern and watch. My people will find them if they are in my realm. Out of courtesy to you as a fellow chief, I will send word if we find them, or the person or remains of your servant. With that, we were clearly dismissed. The doors opened and his throne receded, and the doors closed with more certainty than they opened. Before they did, I thought I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, once again large, slithered past the opening. I was too angry to react. Besides, there had to be other snake chicks in a lair like this one. I was fit to burst. What was that bit about finding remains? I sensed that the Mac Timor understood some things that I did not, and when his chariot wheeled around to leave, I turned my own mount and followed in silence, teeth grinding in frustration. I soon found that the chariot sped ahead. I saw my grandfather sprint forward along the pole to crouch for a moment between the horses. Then, to my amazement and lasting admiration, he sprang into the air and backflipped back into his original space on the chariot, just behind the driver. Guerrer did not rein in the horses during the maneuver or afterwards, but instead urged them to greater speed. I did not have to encourage my own speed. He leapt forward, and we left the guards that lined the avenue choking with the dust from the wheels and hooves. I know that gesture may have seemed petty, but in Otherworld, a warrior must display his superior skills, my 20-something appearing grandfather assured me as we headed back towards the crossroads. You were born chariot rank. It's a skill set that you must eventually learn. You'll have to find a suitable team and a charioteer who would take service with you. In the meantime, it appears that you and your mount have accepted one another. He is now yours, if he consents. My horse whickered softly and nodded. Apparently I was an acceptable rider. You must now provide a name by which you call him. He has his own, but unless you learn to speak Equanese, it will have to be something in common tongue that is agreeable to the both of you. I thought for a moment. I had a buddy in Mundania. His name was Lemongello, but I called him L. I don't want to call you L, I said to the horse. He was a smart dude and tough, but you are too magnificent for such a thing. In response, he raised his front feet and pranced for a few paces, then whinnied in laughter. You have a similar sense of humor to L, maybe something with bike. We both rode bikes exceedingly well. If you ever travel to Mundania with me, we'll have to glamour you as something, and a bike might work on occasion. You are fast enough to be a motorbike. Sounds too short to be a full name, though. Maybe... I rubbed my chin, as I like to do, and I pretended to think deeply. Mighty Bike? MB for short? The way L was L? My mount trotted quietly for a moment, and then nodded again with a little whinnied laughter regarding some internal joke. I looked over at Gingerbeard, grandfather. So what now? If Sorsha is back in the pyramid, shouldn't we be making plans to rescue her? If not, why bother with letting Serpentine know what we know? The big bad wolf spared me a glance. She's not in the pyramid, though she may still be in this realm. Search your feelings. Extend your thoughts to her. Call to her. If she's near, perhaps she will find a way to answer. I couldn't believe he was giving me the wise master yogi routine. However, he was not one to joke often, and he was usually rather obvious when he did, as though he'd been misunderstood once too often. What the heck, I decided. I closed my eyes and thought about my Sorsha. That was easy. I thought about her most of the time these days, to the point of distraction, more often than not. However, I realized that he had meant to think of her very directly, very clearly, to concentrate on nothing but her. I pictured her, not just her physical nature, but I envisioned her sweet and sour and sometimes weird demeanor, her intelligence, her warmth, her care for my well-being. And there she was, clear as day and as real as anything I could have seen with my eyes wide open. She was in a dimly lit room. The light wavered in a weird, dreamlike manner, like it was filtered through water. The lights were reddish, no, greenish, yellow, blue, purple. That was it. There were artificial wave lights, like in Sony's trashy club. Dancer lights. She wasn't dancing, though. She stood against a wall with her arms out to either side. Chained. Sorsha! Apparently I called not only in my mind, but aloud, very aloud, since MB reared his head and both Grandpa and Guerrero whipped their heads towards me, startled. As the vision had faded, I saw her look up at me, look into my eyes, and smile. Maybe the picture was severed and I could not get it back, no matter how hard I concentrated. Give that up, lad. You have seen what you needed to see, and now you are blocked. In which world is she held? I sat in sullen silence for a moment, gaining control of my anger that she'd been in bonds. I think it may be in Mundania, maybe in Sony's club. At first I thought she was underwater, but that was just a trick. He nodded. Mayhaps, or just as likely, a trick within a trick, and she was truly underwater. I thought about that and at last decided, no, they would not be stupid enough to put her in or near that element that gives her the most power. Maybe, but it just doesn't feel right. They've circled on us, taken her to Mundania, or never left in the first place. While we've been here wasting our time, after days here, she could have been in misery for weeks or months in that place. I have to get home and find her. I saw that he was grinning like a happy wolf, one that was hunting, preparing to catch and devour prey. Wolfling. The time passes differently, but not always the way you've experienced them thus far. There is a portal at the crossroads. Since it resides on the border, time will distort differently, and we will have to decide on a dark or light exit. You do understand that dark or light is different than good or evil on this side. It has more to do with methodology than intrinsic value. We Fae all love our chaos and fun, yet we mostly follow the laws, which provide a framework, if not a full structure, in which our societies operate. So now we have to decide whether to go cautiously or whether to take some risks. I have begun this quest with you, so we will continue it together. Let's hasten in any case. Hasten we did, and when we reached the crossroads, he spoke briefly with Gear and then to his horse team. They all seemed to be agreeable, even enthusiastic. Then he looked at me. Well, aren't you going to ask Mighty Bike whether he will accompany you? MB looked at me and grinned and gave the horse equivalent of an eyebrow waggle. Sometime soon I'd have to ask Grandpa how this horse traveled to Mundania to watch TV. Thanks, MB. I knew I could count on you. I looked over at the Mac Tir and Geras. Thank you. To you and your team. My lord, I could ask for no nobler companions. I may not have known much about the Fae, tricks and magicish stuff, but I'd learned the lingo quickly, as I had learned that of scholars and turds in Mundania, language was the smoothest path to gain what I wanted. Should we take a moment to change our attire? The Mac Tir and Geas stared at me a moment. Then the big man grumbled, "No need to do things the hard way. We haven't really practiced, but since you did so well on tracking your lady, I will give you a brief instruction on casting a glamour. It's one of the most basic tools we have, and you should have learned it long ago." It was indeed easy, just a matter of concentration. Much like looking for Sorsha, he warned me that it would have to be renewed each time I slept and awakened. So, what do we go as? And where should we land or enter? My grandfather stared once more. "I'm the expert in Otherworld. You are the expert in Mundania. What do you recommend, Wolfling?" I thought for a moment. I'm tired of caution. I think we need some action. The visit with Serpentine did not seem to rattle him, so maybe it's time to shake up the opposition. Put them on their heels, whether it's flying snakes or something else. The Mac Tir and Geas both managed wolfish grins. Guess it was in their DNA. I saw it as approval and the action the old wolf would have recommended. We started forward towards the portal. Part of my recent experience had been learning to identify portals. Once I'd learned to see rather than to merely look, they became quite apparent. Shimmering lines of various sizes, colors, shapes, and in various positions. Grandfather had warned that they sometimes appeared on the ground and accounted for at least some disappearances from bogs and boulder fields on both sides. We arrived on the edge of Centennial Park. I'd learned that there were Centennial Parks in almost every city that had existed for a century or more, so the place was even less exceptional than I'd already deemed it. It was early evening and more cars drove by than I would have expected. The place had changed. More of the urbanistas had invaded since I'd last visited. The nearby residents had vacated for less green but safer pastures. Now, instead of families and walking pets, there were dope slingers and thugs. Even the structures that lined the avenue around the green space, mostly older homes, had deteriorated noticeably. Many gapped with empty windows and missing doors, and not a few had been damaged or destroyed by fire. Every surface seemed to be covered with graffiti and tags. I thought that we must have been gone for months for such a drastic transition. However, my internal calendar clock combination, a skill that went with identifying and entering portals on purpose, informed me that it was only May 2nd. I wasn't sure that I'd ever grown accustomed to the inconsistency in the passage of time. I realized that I hadn't been to the park since Samhain the previous year. The big man in the chariot had become a sleek limousine with an open top for most observers. I could see it as translucent outline over the reality. MB projected the look of a three-wheeler roadster, the kind I'd had in mind to purchase, with the two wheels in front and one behind, from a new company, Trinity Roadsters. I think MB would have liked it if he could have seen it. Maybe he'd seen commercials? I kept it basic black like his glistening coat. There was not enough room to ride side by side in the two imaginary vehicles, so as the guide I took the lead. It was just as well, since we'd arrived in start of a hood rat storm. One of the streets had been blocked off for racing, and we could see, hear, and smell the festivities as engines roared, tires melted, and the audience cheered or groaned and occasionally fired off a pistol round in celebration. Disappointment, or perhaps the settling of bets. The street on which we'd arrived was across the green space from the impromptu drag strip, and less heavily traveled, or at least navigated at lesser velocities. It was apparent, aside for the cruising and the display of ridiculous paint jobs and accessories. No sooner had we arrived than the blare of horns sounded behind the Mac Tyrmore's chariot, and screamed invectives issued from within the gaudy, bedecked sedan when the driver had to brake. The horses snorted and reared a little. To onlooking mortals, they would have seemed like revved engines. Based on the responses from our horses, the sound of the car horn must have been similar to war trumpets, and grandfather had told me that they enjoyed a good fight as much as he or his charioteer. You may have heard the expression, "Don't poke the bear." The same applies to the big bad wolf. Greer whirled the chariot around and into the opposite lane in a shorter radius than I'd have imagined possible. M.B. paid attention and wheeled, only we stayed in the same lane to face down the approaching hoodmobile. The front passenger had seated himself in the open window and attempted to maneuver a small submachine gun onto the roof of the car so that it would point to what he saw as a high-end limo with tinted glass. The driver couldn't make up his mind whether to watch where he was going or try to swerve towards the chariot. So he jerked the steering wheel to either side and his vehicle swerved like a serpent having a fit. I used my knees to steer M.B. towards the passenger side. I drew the 3-foot-long broadsword attached to M.B.'s saddle. I had yet to master the lance and horsebow, and Grandpa had insisted that it would be more effective than my short sword from horseback. As we passed the car going the opposite direction, I sliced off the gunman's head. It was my first decapitation, and due to luck as much as skill, a bright splash of gore fountained. A little splattered on my arm and M.B.'s tail, but with our forward momentum combined with that of the turdmobile proceeding in the opposite direction, we missed most of the gushing fluid. I tucked my elbow to maintain control of the weapon and continued to parallel the chariot over in the opposite lane. I glanced over at my grandfather, who wore an expression of rage and pride combined. I know he'd wanted the kill, but it made more sense for me to remove the problem in the moment. Besides, the driver had now spun his own car. I looked over my shoulder and saw the body of the shooter flung from its perch to join its head, which had finally stopped rolling down the gutter and now stared up at the windows of a vacant house that stared back, each gaping with surprise at their fate. But I couldn't help but laugh. "I bet your mother told you to stay out of the gutter." It wasn't my best line, but M.B. was polite enough to laugh. Besides, his sense of humor tended towards the morbid. The back windows of the gangster's vehicle disappeared into the doors, and two more soldiers emerged with firearms pointed and flames blazing from the red-hot muzzle as molten lead was flung in all directions. These were typical hood rats, no fire discipline or training, just unrighteous drug-fueled fury backed by too much ammo and too long without consequences. Guerrer turned the chariot, and we grinned at one another as we crossed paths, and I once again turned towards the passenger side, And this time, the Mactirmor faced the driver, as he wanted, with both vehicles headed in a straight line, no swerving. As I completed my second decapitation, I was able to glance the big man in action at last. It would have made sense to ram his lance through the front windshield and skewer the pig driver, even though it would leave the backseat shooter in play. Instead, he ran out along the pole and lunged his spear into the turd's throat, then dragged the edge of the blade across the eyes of the shooter. He held the shield that had been mounted on the chariot to his left in his left hand, and it easily fended off the rounds that came towards him and his team. As the thug leaned back from the pain in his face and the sudden blindness, the rim of the shield slammed under his chin and his head snapped back as his body tumbled into the street. The horses then got in a short trample, and Greer managed to steer a wheel over the sprawling body. It was an internal decapitation, so much cleaner than a sword-hewn wound. Internal applause for Gramps. We were now pointed in the original direction we'd intended to take. So we kept going. The shouts and yells of anger and terror faded behind us. Typically, the gang trash would remonstrate loudly, but had taken no interest in taking action that might put their own necks at risk, literally in this case. They bleated and barked amongst one another for days, but should any authorities arrive, no one would have seen a thing. Besides, it takes a while to describe action. It only takes seconds for it to occur. The speed of combat is always disconcerting, and the incident was over before anyone could effectively aim a camera phone or firearm or even truly comprehend what had happened. The primary cause for upset had been that the driverless vehicle plowed into another in the opposite lane and caused terrific damage to the chassis. I glanced at the limo. Of course, I could clearly see the chariot. Everyone, including the horses, was grinning that wolfish grin once more with the pure delight of mayhem accomplished. "Lord Wolf, we need to get to Sony's crappy club ASAP," I called over to the happier warriors. I'd have to process the battle after we'd tried to rescue Sorsha. Grandfather winked at me and nodded. "Lead the way, Wolfling." We parked just down the block and around the corner from the main entrance to BAE View. We had to avoid the valet parking attendants as we needed to approach with some caution. We paused to adjust our glamours and gear. I kept in mind the same, but until now, the Mactirmor had been hidden by the limo illusion. He stayed pretty much the same, just an adjustment to clothing. His bristling coiffure was plenty menacing. We just added a tailor-made suit and allowed the golden rings he wore on his arms and the massive torque around his neck to show through. He looked like the scary and exotic mother we needed him to appear. "I think Sony will assume you are the assassin that he thinks took out Jaguar and the crew. That could be helpful. He's stupid but cautious. I know that scared people do stupid stuff. But in this case, a little fear might get him to talk. He certainly wasn't scared of me the last time we spoke." The wolfish grin remained, and my grandpa gave another nod as he looked over at me. Over, not down. Had I grown? Or was it just some part of the glamour seeping through into my perception? It was a little disconcerting that he'd been so agreeable this evening. "Before we go, I noted an item in your case that you will want. I meant to tell you earlier. It would have helped. I haven't been to Mundania in a while. I didn't expect the criminals to have those lead-spitting weapons, but they put you at grave risk. Like most of the other items, it belonged to your father. He favored the target style rather than the big hex like mine. I looked at him stupidly for a short moment, a little angry that he had sorted through my stuff while I was out of action. Then I recalled the piece of coffee table. I removed it, and the wolfish grin on my closest living relative widened yet again. It is a well-made piece. You will want to carry it in your left hand or attach it to your belt. There's a lever on the back. Thumb that, and you will have a round shield that will stop the bullets of the mortals. Apologies for forgetting it earlier. I am happy you were not injured. He looked over at MB. And you as well, mighty bike. I hope that you are not angry with an old, forgetful wolf. MB glared for a moment, then snorted laughter. He really was a warped equine, but I was glad he was on our side. As we drew near, I saw that Biggie S was outside with a few of the standard crew members. Papa Boo Boo was likely inside on close watch with Sony. More soldiers out than usual. Sony's nervous about something. I can't believe that he'd knowingly kidnapped Sorsha. He's about as clueless as a gang leader can be, and still get the job done. It was likely a trick to show her being here, maybe to keep us from allying with his crew, but I don't know where else to start. So quoth this raven. The Urban Fae, The Geas, Part 4, by BearLair64, Michael Lockhart. The Mactier Moor lowered his voice. Wolfling, you are talking more than usual. Nervous chatter is out of character for you. Don't worry. Your love is safe for now, according to your own vision. I will help you when the time comes, and between the two of us, we can take out the mortal trash. He held up a hand. I know they are a threat, and can certainly harm or even kill us. Yet, from what you've told me, this Sony and his crew are not true warriors, or even soldiers. There are others nearby who would pose more danger should they choose. Besides, as you surmised, it may all be a trap. I looked at him sidelong. Apparently I'm not the only one who chatters when he's nervous. He swallowed his retort, since we'd reached hailing distance from the pile of animated excrement gathered at the front of the club. Biggie S? Sony here. We got business to discuss. You'll want to hear from me. I tucked my chin respectfully to show that while I intended to be polite, I wasn't going to take crap from him or anyone else. Coyote, you show up at some funny times. Things is bad. We could use you soon. You showing up here might put you on our side, if not on crew. He rumbled, as only a true large specimen of humanity could, like an elephant. We'd never spoken much, but the big dude seemed righteous enough, turd or no. I enjoyed the moment. It was rare to see anyone loom as well as my grandfather. The two massive men were of a size, though Biggie S has gone to gut and butt with age. I gave a sidewise twitch of my head to indicate the Mactier Moor. This is Big Mac, my new employer. I wanted to let Biggie's arse know that my services were now committed, and not to his silly boss. It was also fun to use a ridiculous cognomen. He grunted and led us into the interior. The soft thumping of bass we'd heard from the outside became a storm of throbbing, skull-rattling misery when we entered. Through the glamour, I could see Grandpa stiffen and frown in disapproval. I, of course, enjoyed seeing my elder discomforted, the only real purpose of the highest volume settings. He should visit Mundania more often, I thought uncharitably. Needs to update on the cultural norms. Just before we entered Sony's sanctuary, I gave the big man a brief, wolfish smile that was open to his interpretation. Sony sat in his imperial glory. That is to say, leaned back in his stupid office chair with the two big wings, his fingers steepled in a bad imitation of a Bond villain. The two dark lenses of his glasses could not entirely hide his expression. He was worried, and likely not about us. I waited on him to speak first. My role had shifted from supplicant to badass minion of the big bad wolf, which was reality. Finally, he'd nodded to indicate that we could sit in his magnificent presence. We remained standing. "So what's up, Coyote? Who's your friend?" "Sony, I'd like you to meet my boss, the Big Mac. Some people call him the Big Bad Wolf. He calls me Wolfling instead of Coyote." I grinned savagely. I knew that he would not comprehend that Wolfling was the diminutive for wolf, but he'd catch the implication. "We're looking for one of our associates, a young lady of remarkable beauty." I left the description of Sorsha to his imagination, knowing that while limited, he could envision those who suffered at his hands or whom he'd like to. Best not go there. I'd only get furious. Besides, if he had captured her or someone else had sold her to him, he'd know who I meant. I was surprised when he pursed his lips and looked gravely at me over the rim of his snakeskin on his glasses. "Some dudes brought her by here, tried to sell her to me. I told them I didn't want no part of it. Chicks like that don't belong here, and somebody would notice. I told them to take her over to Serpentina's bunch. He's like Jaguar. He likes to buy women's." I nodded and pretended that I believed him. Maybe I did. He was a dim bulb, but canny about crooked matters. I was afraid of that. "I know you'd have treated her right no matter what. Wouldn't have hurt her if she mentioned me, since we're friends." I just let him off the hook, and he knew it. The poor cogs in his brain must be smoking with friction. He spoke with me, but he couldn't stop his eyes from flickering constantly to the behemoth standing next to me. "Thing is, we need to know for sure if she's at Serpentina's. You got any word?" I saw the beads of sweat on his forehead, and his eyes rolled a little behind the shaded lenses. "Look, like I said, I tried to stay out of it. Serpentine might have bought her. I don't know the dude, but I hear he ain't stupid, so maybe not. All I know is I ain't got her. It was only yesterday. She might be anywheres. But I'm thinking not too far. Somebody wants her here in this hood for some reason." I felt like he knew more. But before I could press the matter, the dull thrum of bass that penetrated even in the insulated walls of the sanctum sanctorum of rancid perfidiousness that was Sony's office screeched to a halt, and a series of popping and ripping noise erupted out in the building, accompanied by screams of terror. I looked to the Mac Timor. "More lead slingers?" He nodded at my left hand, and I took the hint. When we emerged from Sony's reeking office, I grasped my short sword, and to my astonishment, a series of concentric wooden boards emerged from a round piece of metal I clutched in my hand. I'd glamored it to look like a cell device. The wood was soon covered by something like leather, and numerous metallic studs that I later found formed the pattern of a wolf's gaping maw. We charged through the doors and leapt out into the fray. It was risky, but I let the Lord Wolf, with his larger shield, go first, so we were mostly covered. The band that he wore around his head had converted to a tall, hard helm. I wondered for a split second whether my leather one would do the same. I really needed to learn to concentrate during battle, I chided myself. People fled in every direction. Several attempted to hide from the violence that exploded all around them. A few lay and screamed or writhed in agony, and a few others lay sprawled unnaturally and utterly still. I dove behind the dubious cover of one of the big pleather VIP dance tables, my poor ears ringing from the assault by large speakers and heavy rounds. I hadn't brought along any long-range weapons. I wasn't sure who was firing at whom anyway. No point returning fire on potential allies. I scanned briefly and saw that Sony's crew was getting pounded. Guys in shiny white suits, uniformly carrying AK-style rifles, advanced through the club. They were organized and supported one another. Biggie S was down, but Papa Boo Boo still raged on, and Sony, whose courage I always found dubious, was blinking away with a shiny little pistol. One of his targets fell as I watched. Then it converted into a writhing, twitching form. Apparently it had possessed a natural glamour and life. In death it reminded me of the golden Lamiajic, only the scales were white and it was smaller. The attacker was fey and clearly associated with Serpentine. I looked for the Mactir Moor and found him in the next VIP booth. We gave each other a nod and sprang into action. I rolled forward and thrust the sword upward into the belly of one of Serpentine's snake dudes. I withdrew the blade to a spurt of ichor and swept it into the lower leg of the next soldier to approach. He fell at my feet and I finished him with a quick thrust to the throat. Grandpa had already taken out 4 of his short spear, and the shield smashed into bodies and broke bones in a satisfying manner. I recalled my training. Shields were for offense and interception more than static defense, especially the smaller varieties like mine. I know, slow-witted, but things happened so quickly that I didn't have time for self-flagellation. Instead, I smashed the rim of the shield into the face and ruined the white suit with the creature's own fluids as they spilled and dribbled down his chest. He had no time to lament his ruined nose and clothes, though. I crowned him with the pommel of my sword, and when he fell, I kicked him in the gut and used my foot to prod him away and up under a table. I wanted a prisoner to question, provided I survived. I waded back into the affray, and the white-suited snake's troopers began to give way. Their retreat was as orderly as had been their attack, and there weren't many left, so it was swift. The big bad wolf and I let them flee. Sony's crew had taken some heavy damage. There were a few civilian casualties. A couple of the girls had been shot, but I saw no mostly naked corpses, which was a relief. Maybe it shouldn't matter, but somehow dead, innocent dancers seem more horrid to me than dead, innocent goons and perverts. At any rate, Sony had survived, and Papa Boo Boo, well wounded, managed to limp and lumber to his boss's side, seized hold of my prisoner and dragged him out into the still flashing and colorful lights. The reflected spots of white light from the disco ball roved across his features. The place was eerily silent, or I was deaf from the thunder of firearms and bass at high volume. I kicked him awake by finding a tender spot and rendering mild pressure with the toes and heels of my boots. He eventually roused with hisses like a steam kettle. I hovered the blade, aimed at his right eye a few feet from him. "Why are you attacking here?" He glared, no more than I expected, but then he looked past me, and his eyes grew wide in terror. "Lord Wolf," he stammered, "I am but a soldier. I do as my master bids." He dropped his eyes in clear deference. The Mactir Moor stepped forward. "You will answer the questions from my grandson as though they were mine. If you speak truly, we will take an eye and send you back to the other world. You will not be able to return to this world, and will be blind in that eye for the rest of your life. Yet you will count yourself grateful." He growled out the last part in a way that made the hairs on my neck raise. It had an even stronger effect on the prisoner. "Mercy, Lord, I will do as you order. It was an ambush. Our master knew you would come here to find the girl. I do not know how he knew we did not take her here in the first place." He had anticipated my questions, which meant he likely knew even more. He had been well briefed, and now he perhaps wished for more mercy, but I was all out of it. "You say that your master didn't take her. Who did? Where is she?" His eyes shifted to me and he hesitated, perhaps not quite feeling the fear he did for the elder wolf. But one twitch of the eye at that stalwart, and he hung his head. "I don't know which one, but I have heard a great lady. Master only wants to take you out because you might interfere with his plans for this part of Mundania. We were not told where she was, only that she might be bait for our own plans." I looked towards my grandfather. "Anything else, Lord?" He shook his head, and I quickly thrust my blade and pricked the reptilian prick in his eye. He screeched appropriately and shrank in on himself, once more hissing. I walked away to let him scramble to his feet and make his way to the nearest portal. I was sure that there was one in the vicinity, likely the same that the Lamia had used to murder Mercedes. My hearing had started to return. It seemed I healed more rapidly these days. Maybe spending time in the other world had some healthy side effects. I could hear sirens in the distance. "Grandfather, perhaps it's time to go back and retrieve our friends." The big man looked at me and grinned. "It's okay. The first to arrive will be an ally, and the others will be rerouted to other places since she is a supervisor." Somehow I knew which supervisor he meant. My old friend with the beaky nose, Lieutenant Falk. Shortly before she arrived, another being walked into our club from the side entrance. Skittle. I had rarely set eyes on the gang leader of the smallest but most efficient gang in the hood. Now, with my fancy headgear, I could see him as he truly was. He still looked like a fit young man I remembered, but the faint outline of his street clothes no longer obscured the magnificent leopard headdress and mantle that adorned him and the large ostrich plume that waved above it to proclaim him a chieftain of his clan. I thought it odd the first time I'd encountered him that someone so obviously athletic would carry a walking stick. However, it was now revealed as a spear with an elaborate but deadly-looking tip. He looked at the Mac Moor and nodded respectfully in greeting. "Lord Wolf, Tyree," he said simply. Grandfather returned the gesture. "Lord Leopard, Shabil. It's been too long since you have visited Otherworld. We've missed you at our table." Skittle, now revealed to have much more dignified handle, Shabil, smiled. "Perhaps you should come to this side more often, my friend. Many things are happening that will affect us all, as they have so often." Tyree grunted. Perhaps. I believe you've met my grandson. We've been calling him Wolfling. I don't think that the coyote would want him to continue to use his name as a cognomen. One never knows with him, though. He might laugh. He might snarl." Shabil took in the scene. "It seems that one of our antagonists has decided to take over this little slice of Mundania. Since I have interest here at Well, I feel I must intercede, since he has attacked our mutual friend." He indicated Sony, who sat in a chair next to Biggie X's corpse. "Then we may once more fight, side by side." I couldn't hold it any longer. Faye's standards of courtesy are not. "So, Lord Leopard, do you by any chance know the whereabouts of my lady?" He looked at me patiently. An elder, who appeared as youthful as did my grandfather, looking upon a precocious child. "Of course. Why do you think I'm here? I would have brought her, but the cellars wanted her to go either to Sony or Serpentine to cause the most conflict and confusion. However, I know who they are. It was my turn to wait patiently. I forced myself to clamp down any stupid retorts or frustrated sides and teeth grinding. Presently, Shabil gave a brief nod of approval. Apparently, he approved of my ability to adjust to the reality that he knew something I wanted to know, and that I'd have to wait until he was good and ready to deliver it. It's not Serpentine or his affiliates, at least not the direct ones. She is guarded by a griffin, and in the care of no less than the witch, Sophronia, and of course the great lady she serves. Your lady must be valuable to have attracted the attention of such powerful beings. He looked up at the Mactirmore with what I interpreted as a little caution when he stated the names of the witch. Grandfather nodded. I feared as much. My wife will do anything to torment me. My blood seethes, but does not yet boil. My reason is intact. We have more to discuss before we act. I was the only one with no clue, so I just rolled with it. So where might we find this Stregonon grandma witch and her pet griffin? Shabil answered Tyree rather than me, his brat of a grandson. Where else would we find a griffin but the tallest building? I'm just glad it's not a dragon. I wasn't sure whether he was serious about the dragon, but I decided that I was glad we would have to face this one as well. I just couldn't be part of a story about rescuing a damsel from a dragon. Too cliché. Griffins were pretty dowdy guardians, though, from what I'd read, and my grandma the witch sounded like a challenge. Plus, she was my grandmother. I hoped that we wouldn't have to meet her great lady, but I needed Grandpa Wolf to do some splainin'. I was relieved that I'd have two such renowned warrior chieftains with me. Then Grandfather looked at me. Well, Wolfling, she's your woman. How do you want to go about this? Fubar, I griped internally. Snafu. Figured he just wanted me to come up with something. I was saved, however, by the realities of the moment and the arrival of the police. Lieutenant Falk stalked into the club, sharp eyes flitting from corpse to lesser casualties, to still living potential threats, and finally to the Fae. My lords, quite a mess for me and mine, but it will be blended into the background of other incidents before the sun rises. She looked down her great beak at me, and for the first time I saw. It truly was a beak, at least the top part, though her chin was human enough. That feathery hair of hers consisted of actual feathers. She was Then the connection formed. Falcon woman. I had to suppress sardonic laughter. No wonder she always appeared so superior in her demeanor. Raptors tend to have that sharp glance and judgmental glare in their eyes, always looking down regardless of the height of the subject of their scrutiny. Good evening, Lieutenant Falk. I managed to contain the laughter into a friendly smile. She did not return it, though I finally realized that she likely couldn't. She had no means to physically smile. She nodded, and I continued. We will be conducting an operation at the Fulshire Tower tonight. I hope that attention may be focused elsewhere. I tried to be as polite as possible. We needed her more than I liked, so I might as well use my charms, the ones that, so far, had failed to gain anything positive from this one. I promise I won't steal anything or set any fires. My smile morphed briefly into a smirk, which she either failed to note or ignored. We can take care of it. We will be busy tonight. I must get the current situation in hand. I had to let others handle the Centennial Park beheading case, a media festival that has attracted the attentions of my superiors. They will be busy for some time, and no one in this area has called in the firefight that resulted in this bloodbath. I believe that the mortal who runs this establishment will need attention shortly. Shall I ensure that he believes that he is beholden to you three for his salvation and protection from the popo?" I still didn't trust her, and I was sure she felt the same way about me. Yet we made the best of it, being allies and all. "Yes, please, Lieutenant. I'll have a quick word with Sony before we go. Perhaps you might want to hear, so our stories are consistent." With that I approached Sony, who rose, a bit unsteadily, though more from shock and aging joints than any apparent wounds. "Sony, you see that my new boss and I can handle things. Looks like you owe Skittle as well. Sorry about Biggie S, but he did his job to the last. Best take care of Papa Boo Boo. He's going to need some 911 action. We have to go finish some work of our own. Lieutenant Falk here will help you with cleanup. She knows nobody here wants uniformed attention. Once we take care of our own business, we'll help you with Serpentine's bunch. Their trap was sprung, and they lost too many troops in springing it. They won't be back before we are." I detested so much about the man, but he had on occasion been good to me and to others. "Take care, Sony. See you soon." We have been estranged for a couple of centuries. She chose to align with dark powers. Since we are in a constant struggle, it wouldn't do for us to be too far into one another's counsels. She's never forgiven me for taking your father into my service. When he chose sides and, of all people, married your mother, it put Sophronia in a bad place." The MacTiermore had maintained an introspective look as he explained. Now he gave me an even stare as we paced towards downtown. Skittle Shabil followed in an East African-style war cart, drawn by 4 big leopards. His driver was none other than the young fellow who had taken Elle's place on the lookout. I wondered briefly whether Elle had been the driver before he was killed. The war cart and team were glamored to look like a big SUV in which Skittle normally rode, but it had a mundanous stereo. Shabil loved music, especially Motown. He didn't blast it. He instead played it at just above normal and absorbed the strains of Percy Sledge as he belted out, "When a man loves a woman." Apropos, I thought. The passions and stresses of romance blended perfectly, so that one could hardly tell whether the singer wailed in pain or groaned with ecstasy. Percy had obviously been hopelessly in love at some point. Maybe Shabil as well. "I don't think that your grandmother wishes to harm you," the MacTiermore continued. "She's likely just wants a word and will try to convince you to commit to her mistress or whomever they serve in turn." He rumbled. "It is, of course, up to you." I returned his gaze. "So why not just approach me and speak? That's pretty much what you did. After your servant drugged me into unconsciousness." I raised my hand to prevent him from, metaphorically at least, biting off my head. I know I failed to be cautious, and it was a well-taught lesson in true Fae fashion. So far you haven't tried to sell me on one side or the other, just shown me what I've needed to see. Does she not realize by hurting or even threatening my Sorsha that she is unlikely to ever gain my support or cooperation? He shrugged. "It's how that side operates. They prefer force or threats of force to reasoned persuasion. The philosophy is that once you are aligned, you will get to have others to bully, while you live in fear of consequences should you fail. The bullying allows one to relieve the stress of being bullied. It's a vicious cycle and subverts free will, the essence of being Fae. I thought about it and decided that the system for dark Fae wasn't unlike the government types in the mortal realm. Machiavelli had spoken particularly mockingly and partially in earnest about various uses of fear and whether it was preferable to inspire love or fear in those one ruled. It seemed to me that, as usual, with free-thinking beings, regardless of realm, that the answer was never to cut and dried as philosophers dreamed. If you two are on opposing sides, how did you end up married to her? It had taken a while, but I had finally made it to the obvious question. None too soon, as we had just passed the first of the taller buildings that signified we'd arrived at the primary downtown region. He smiled, clearly with fond memories. You had to look upon her in those days. How lovely and fierce she was, strong as steel and as sweet as the honey that matched her flowing locks. He shook himself, but went on in the enchanted tone he'd assumed. I was love-struck before I knew what hit me. At first I thought it a spell and tried to fight it. I was in company of our chief and his delegation at the High Court of Powers of Light. The Dark Powers were in attendance. Regardless of whether we are at peace or war, the High Courts of Light and Dark meet twice per year. Once, at each High Court in turn. The official proceedings were done, and there was a great ball. The dancers parted for just a moment, and there she was. She stood next to her mistress, the one she serves even now. Our eyes met, and we both understood that we were doomed, always to love one another, yet always eventually to strive. He finally came out of it. She is very dangerous. That is what you need to know for the moment. She will do her best to persuade you. She may even try a spell or three. It would be best if you choose your side beforehand, but I will not push you. You are of both light and dark heritage on both sides of your family, as are most all Fae. He left me no time to ponder that bombshell. Since we were very close to our destination, I looked at my grandfather and then back at Shabil. So, it's just us? No war bands? He frowned at me. We assumed that you had a plan to approach with only a small group. This is your quest, as I have said. It's late in the game to stop and gather a large force. I choked back a snotty reply, and after one extra large gulp of air, managed to stop gasping like a fish on a bank. Fair enough, I ground through my teeth. We are a powerful team. Maybe you and Lord Leopard can hold off the Griffin while I deal with Grandmother and free Sorsha. I'd offer more of a plan, but who knows how they will have things arranged. I've never been inside this building. It's a private company. I just recall hearing in school that they had wanted to build it on the mound. I indicated a rise of land beyond and to the west of Fulshire Tower. However, the other company that eventually got the land won in court by offering the organically friendly structure you now see, or would if there was sufficient light. The city management loved the idea of the ultra-modern Fulshire Tower juxtaposed with the plant-covered, as much garden as building, the mound complex. I had to cut off further architectural speculations. We have arrived, my lords. Shall we park on the street or use the garage? I looked at my two more experienced companions. Shabil smiled. I would like to start with the garage. It is bound in the earth element and is strong place for beings such as we to begin. If we can find a portal, perhaps we can go around some of the obstacles and challenges I'm sure that the dear lady has placed for us between here and the rooftop. The big bad wolf simply nodded. Agreed. Shortcuts can be perilous, but it sounds like the long path might be worse. I encouraged MB ahead, and he pranced down into the first level of the garage. I think he was nervous and just showing off to cover it. He hadn't smiled much since we'd left Sony's place and hadn't laughed once. I patted his neck encouragingly. Time to earn our oats, my friend. He whickered in feigned mirth. True bravery, I thought. Frightened, but going ahead anyway. Good show, noble steed, I thought, in genuine affection for my equine friend. From the street, the garage looked inviting, a gleam of artificial light emanating from the ground-level lot. When we turned downward towards G1, however, we descended into darkness. I activated the moon pommel on my short sword, the tip of the spears of my two lead companions glowing with similar light. It made us a target, but dispelled the Herbesian gloom that was practically a living entity that swarmed and closed around us. Just as ahead, as the pathway turned left and downward to the next level, a golden glow suffused the air directly ahead. It looked like a bunch of lightning bugs, drifting in globular pattern. I raised my hand to swat at them when we got close enough, but Grandpa Wolf called out to me, "Rob, let them be. Fae come in all sizes, and these are the smallest variety, and solidly aligned with light fae." He shifted focus to the hovering, swarming entities. "Greeting, wayfinders. We poor blind travelers seek to find our way aloft, but find that we must first plunge into the earth. Will you guide us in some way for some distance?" For the first time in my life, I heard what I'd call tinkling laughter. Numerous tiny voices joined in to make a sound near the normal conversational volume for standard-sized folk, but very high-pitched like tiny bells. I peered at the swarm and tried to pick out some individuals. Each being was about an inch high or so, with large eyes and big front teeth that made them appear as though they constantly smiled. Their wings were something like a butterfly or moth, but looked more durable. The glow emanated from bulbs at the end of stalks that grew from the center of their wings where they attached to their shoulders. Their hair tended to be long and wispy for the females and spiky for the males. At least, I think that was a distinction of the two sexes. Their body shapes were pretty close to human standard, just on tiny scale, and their toes and fingers were pretty long in proportion to their arms and legs, probably for grasping when they weren't flying. They spoke in concert much as they laughed. It made their musical voices quiver a little. In other circumstances, by myself, in a dark forest, it would have been spooky.
"Greetings, traveler, and welcome to the dwelling. We are indeed here to guide, at least for a portion of your way. We will take you to the upward path that is guarded, but the least difficult. Stay on the road and follow us."
I had thought of the building as a business center, but apparently it was a dwelling as well. Fortunately, these occupants had invited us, so I was safe from my geish. I needed to be more careful of those things. The swarm led us downward through the passage from G1 down to G2. The parking spaces remained in the dark, but the path that we followed remained in the light, much like when the wild hunt pursued me. I wondered briefly whether these allies would lead us to doom or salvation, but ultimately I trusted my mentors, the big ones. There were definitely objects, perhaps living, in the Stygian bowels of the garages. Hints of horns and fangs, gleams and glows of eyes, yet they merely seethed and kept outside the circle of light, cast by the wee fae who swarmed about us in a protective circle. At last we arrived in front of what was normally a freight elevator. Large as it was, it still would not have contained our entire party, had it not also been a type of porthole. It was on level G3, which was marked with signs that proclaimed, "Employees only beyond this point," in forbidding red letters on yellow backgrounds. The same message was printed across the metal drop bar gate that prevented vehicle traffic, but lifted quietly out of the way for our contingents to pass. The quivering tinkles spoke in unison once again.
"This is your best path upward. It won't take you all the way at first. Those above will sense your approach and be warned by their minions. You have a good start. We wish you well, and are honored to have played a part in your quest. The Lady Sorsha is quite remarkable."
I wondered what damage mortals might do these lovely beings with something like drones. It would be an interesting battle between aeronauts. But it made me sad to think of tiny, lifeless bodies strewn. "Sorsha, have you seen Lady Sorsha?" My voice must have contained the plaintiveness I felt, since they answered,
"Of course. This place is adjacent to our dwelling. We met her when she arrived and have kept her company. You are a most fortunate being."
With a chorus of tinkling bell, laughter, they sped away back up the tunnel. As the door closed and the lights of the wee folk disappeared behind, there was a general stampede of dark beings towards our coach. They did not make it, but the car rang with their assault, and the clamor and shaking made the already perilous ascent seem doomed before it had gotten under way. As the indicator light buttons of various floors above the parking level changed and displayed our rise, the shouts, screams, and other calls of frustration faded. There were 74 floors in addition to 2 level penthouse floors on top and 3 parking levels, 79 altogether. We're in for a long trip, I thought. As the car ascended smoothly and swiftly, naturally, the Murphy and his law rode with us, and it was not a long trip. We shuddered to a halt at floor 33. I noted that my companions tightened their grip on their weapons, and each raised his shield just a bit. So I did the same. I kept hold of the longsword, even though we were indoors. I figured that since we could fit 2 chariots and a large war horse in a freight elevator car, we were unlikely to run out of the room once we exited the confines. Besides, the 2 more experienced warriors had kept long weapons. There was no ding. The doors did not automatically open. We just started for an uncomfortable moment. I felt that any moment we might plunge downward, but we just sat, listening to the metallic popping and creaking that might accompany any elevator halted mid-rise and scare the crap out of acrophobes. Finally, I reached out with the sword tip and touched the seam between the sliding doors. I expected to have to pry or shove, but the doors immediately sprang open, and a wan gray light filled the space in front of the compartment and was swallowed by our own lights. Outside the doors stood a pack of slavering wolves. For a moment, I thought we might have found allies, but then I heard the deep rumble that emanated from my grandfather's chest. Dark wolves." Greer drove the chariot team forward, which forced MB and me to surge ahead. Not that I had encouraged him. Mighty Bike plowed through the fight on his own with a deep trumpeting bay. He was his own war trumpet. I heard the screams of leopards behind and the scrabbling scratches of their extended claws on the metal floor. We exited in a ferocious charge of all hands. Well, and claws and hooves and wheels. There were 9 of the large beasts in the lobby, or whatever space might be. Clearly it resided between realms. Perhaps a vestibule? There was plenty of room to maneuver, and 3 enemies apiece to fight. So, of course, the pack divided differently than expected. 2 each attacked the chariots, and the other 5 charged me. I was fortunate that MB knew his business. I soon found that I was not nearly as adroit at riding as I had thought. He had to concentrate on the fight and didn't have time to coddle his rider with a smooth gait. However, I managed to get in a nice, if I'm being honest, a lucky strike. No pun intended. Most people these days would not know that lucky strikes were once a popular style of ready-rolled cigarettes, popular in old movies and dime novels. The blade cleaved the skull of my initial attacker in twain. Unfortunately, I didn't have time for elation, since the second one had snapped its jaws shut on my shield and dragged it downward, for the third to be able to leap over the top. MB had done well. He'd overrun one opponent, and when he reared, he bopped the second in the snout with his front hooves. The blow elicited a satisfying crunch of bone and spray of blood. When my number 3 cleared the top of the shield, I acted purely on instinct and my old martial arts training. I delivered a right cross, and my fist and the pommel of my sword impacted the snarling visage of the left cheek and jowl. It went spinning down to the floor, but quickly shook itself and snapped at MB's rear flank. That was a mistake. Mighty was my bike, and he dished in the bugger's chest with a backward kick. I looked into the eyes of the creature that had now pulled my shield almost completely from my arm and had me sagging dangerously on my perch. I opened my left hand and let it drag the shield to the ground. The sudden release of resistance caught the thing by surprise, and just before MB swirled to face the last remaining imminent threat, I drove the tip of the sword into its eye. I found I was sweating and panting. MB pranced around a bit. I looked around desperately to check on my little warband. The chariot teams had finished their business and was already back in the elevator car. The 2 warriors and drivers pretended to look impatient, but they could not hold it for long and soon favored me with savage chuckles. "You'll find that too many of our folk joined the dark powers," the Mactir Moor, whose accent had thickened just enough to notice, informed me. "It's a hard thing to slay one's own, or those who should be with us. It's why we are less than a clan than we should be. Division in the pack, the powers. Either side are adept at turning individuals towards one pathway or another." Shabil nodded in agreement. "The same applies among the leopard clan. We never know until we make eye contact which way a being has chosen." The Urban Fae, the Geas, Part 5. By then, MB had pranced his way into the car and turned back towards the door, confidence clearly restored. It closed, and while no one activated the button, Penthouse Level 1 gleamed, and the light buttons for other floors began to flit by once again. At floor 66, we slid to a halt, and the doors opened quickly. The light in the space ahead was faint, and shadows moved in front of what there was. Inky, spiky shapes that were almost familiar. Hutao? This was a true swarm of the little monsters. I couldn't tell how many there were, but certainly more than enough for each of us to face. This time, Shabil did not charge his chariot, but the driver released the 4 leopards into the swarm of terror. Shabil and the driver raised cowhide shields and stood back to back as they cavorted in rapid, graceful, and lethal dance, slicing off bloody fillets as often as piercing hides. The Mactir Moors, true to form, urged his charioteer to drive the team straight forward. The stout horses waded through the masses of dusky forms and trampled many as the wheels ground on feet and bodies, and the tall figures slashed a path to the rear of the enemy formation. The driver wheeled and started to carve up the flank to their right. I followed in their wake, and when we reached the back of the mass, turned left to attack the other flank. It was awkward to slash towards my shield side, so I bashed in a number of hideous faces and skull tops with my shield. MB did not fare as well as he had with the wolves. These smaller opponents slithered between his trampling hooves and slashed at him. They delivered many clear, painful blows as we soon found ourselves backed into a corner of the large space at bay. MB faced the walls where they joined and let fly time after time with kicks from his rear legs. I dismounted and crouched and slashed and smashed. I was careful to avoid driving my blade into the bodies, but eventually I had no choice and slammed the tip through the midsection. I withdrew quickly and found that the body did not collapse around it, as with the last time I'd fought this type of creature. The Hu Tao had been as bad dead as they were alive. I heard the roars of the leopards as they created a circle of teeth, claws, and death around their driver and chieftain. I lost sight of the big bad wolf, but assumed that he and his team were committing mayhem somewhere in the vicinity. There wasn't much time for gawking. I noticed, however, that the press of bodies had lessened noticeably once we each found a fighting space. Black, wrinkled piles that had once been goblin folk were scattered all around the room. I realized that I could see better than I had previously. There was a glow that emanated from just below my left eye, a golden glow from the gnome glyph. The glistening eye to my front fluttered and turned away from the glow in consternation. That was when I noticed the difference. These were not Hu Tao, but some other similar horror. I recalled the stories that Freda and her husband had told me. These were kobolds, another type of small goblin folk, usually found inside of the earth or enclosed spaces, whereas the Hu Tao were outdoorsy fellows. It appears that these had more scales than feathers, and were just a little larger, and more robust than their hideous arboreal cousins. They carried an astonishing variety of weapons rather than the javelins and forks of the Hu Tao. The weaponry more resembled that of the gnome folk. No matter the handle, they were terrifying to behold en masse, except that we had decimated that mass, and the creatures now hesitated. I noticed that there were 3 paused conflicts, and that my companions and I had been cleaning house, or building literally, of these armed and vicious vermin. I was silently grateful that we had yet to meet any of the larger variety of goblin folk. Then the doors to the regular elevators opened, courtesy of the Murphy and his law, or perhaps his companions Fubar and Snafu. Surely there were gremlins among the dark powers. However, what emerged from the gloom of the elevator cars was no throng of wee folk. The smaller kobolds grinned wickedly, almost in unison, and then backed away to make paths for their larger brethren. The bigger ones lumbered into the room and divided up to focus on their enemies. As the crowd shifted, I saw that the Maktir Mor and his team occupied the next corner, and that Shabil's contingent occupied the next, closest to the freight elevator and our escape route. A dim light issued from the staff elevators, and I could see our new opponents backlit as they emerged, each squinting into the light of our battle group. They were mostly under 6 feet in height, but their shoulders were ridiculously wide, and their bodies were thick and covered with coarse, matted hair that reeked of multitudinous filth. They had big feet that flapped when they struck the hard floor, and big hands that grasped clubs and crude stone maces. Their arms were long and drooped past their knees. Their lower faces were heavy, and jagged teeth or fangs protruded beyond their bulbous lips in various directions. They had almost no foreheads, so hopefully they weren't too bright. There was only a dozen of them, but that was clearly enough to alter the tide of the fight. I called out to my grandfather, "Rally to Shabil's corner!" the swarm had shifted enough that with our sudden charge we were able to scatter our smaller opponents, many of whom had turned to watch the grand foot-flapping mass as their allies approached the engagement. We removed several more kobolds from our consideration and joined Shabil and his team. I saw that MB was looking weak and his head drooped, but there was no time to stop and render aid. There were now 2 clear enemies aligned and facing one another. The goblin folk and our much smaller contingent glared at one another, and each side wrought up the courage to once again engage. Even monsters wanted to live and to win in war. This was not going to be an easy fight. The little beasts scuttled aside as the big goblins, much like Tolkien's Urks, formed a ragged line and charged. I shortly realized that the stench of these skunk apes was their most ferocious aspect. They were incredibly strong and fast, but lacked agility and skill. Yet it was hard to fight while gagging on their awful effluvian. Had the kobolds swarmed in and attacked us low while the skunk apes swung overhead as they almost invariably did, our quest may have ended then and there, but they hung back, confident that their hulking friends would win without them. I later realized from their ferocity of the large variety of creatures, they would have lost their tempers had any of the kobolds crossed their paths. As it was, 2 of them became entangled when one tried to sideswipe with his club, and the 2 eventually beat one another to death right in front of me. It was a brief respite, since it foiled the attacks of others, but fascinating in its primitive pathos. These things were dumb, much dumber than hood rats, who often possessed more cunning than people credited them with. These things actually suffered in comparison to low-life mortals. I did them a favor and killed 4 of them. It wasn't as hard as I'd feared. Like dodgeball with a sword and target sealed, the best technique was to slash open their bellies when they raised their weapons. When I did that with the first of my victims, I felt the satisfying drag of flesh as my blade parted it, like carving a juicy steak. Then came the counterstrike. These creatures did not swoon and faint at the sight of their impending mortality, but instead struck fiercely, too stupid to know that they were dead on their feet. I caught a bruising blow on my shield face, rather than at the rim, and almost died when the next monster hurled himself at me, his stink nearly palpable in the near press of striving bodies. Once again I found myself peering triumphantly, and then realized that my companions had already finished off their opponents. I really needed to be able to watch them fight. Of course it would help if the bulk of forces would attack one of them instead of me. I felt a heavy pressure on the back of my shoulder and saw MB sag. His head had nudged me as he staggered and almost fell. He was clearly hurting in distress. We had to finish this and get help for him. Our little army had taken some pretty serious damage. 2 of the leopards were down, injured or worse, and Shabil's driver leaked from a wound in his abdomen and another on his left arm. His shield was gone. A shredded remnant of it lay at his feet. Guarer limped badly and grimaced each time he had to shift his balance, and both of his horses looked spent. One was sprawled on the floor, still breathing, but clearly blown from exhaustion. I was angry to a degree that I'd become a fae. No humorous internal dialogue rose into my mind, only blinding rage. Without an articulable word, I charged forward, slashing and bashing once more at the kobolds. They were still standing around, stunned at the rapid and thorough defeat of those they considered to be so strong. Apparently they had never encountered high fae in battle. The fact is, my charge started in fear for my comrades as much as fury in my own heart. I was worried for MB and the other animals and the chariot drivers, my family and friend, and above all, I wanted to get to my Sorsha before any harm befell her. I basically lost my mind to the fury. I'd never done that. I don't recall much, just images obscured by a red mist that oculated my sight, yet did not leave me blind since it glowed like fire. It was only when I started to fade and I stood sweating and gulping for air that I realized that the Mac Timur, Shabil, and the rest had merely watched as my emotions manifested in death and destruction. The few survivors limped or crawled, all with wounds, back to the elevator cars, and on to wherever goblin folk ultimately fled. My anger had dissipated into annoyance. The others had left me to fight alone? What the heck? When I realized that I hadn't needed any assistance, I'd taken some bruises and small cuts earlier, but nothing had harmed me in the last, however long I'd checked out in that rage state. Grandfather's lips slid back in a tight, grim smile. I suspected as much. Wolfling no more, but Ulfhednar in the northern tongue, a wolf mind in battle. Mac Tir Dirig is now your title. The Red Wolf. Fitting. Red like the fox and coyote, but large and fierce like wolf. You may recall the origin of the term berserk from the Bear Clan, the mindless, enraged fighters. The Bull Clan and most other warrior factions have them. Ulfhednar is what we call the condition. The blessing in the Wolf Clan. It rarely comes to more intellectual folk. He trailed off. It was not the time for grandiose speeches, and he seemed to like them on a rare occasion when he was given to praise valor or some meritorious accomplishment. I stared for him in a moment, and then Mighty Bike at last slumped to the floor. His sides heaved, and his tongue lolled from his mouth. There was no more time for explanations. We had immediate need to locate a portal. I was still recovering my wits, and my thoughts kept scattering. Fortunately, Shabil had kept his head and had a talent for the more esoteric fatalents. There's a portal 3 floors above us. I believe it leads to a light place. It took a while and almost an entire bottomless flask of Osig Nabil to get MB and the others back on their feet. We all had to take drinks to stem the insidious poisons from the envenomed blades of our enemy. It was too late for one of the leopards. Deg-Deg-Ah had taken a wound to her eye, and now lay forever still. Shabil and his driver, whose name I learned was Mid-Amus, clearly mourned for the unfortunate member of their team, and I detected that they seethed with desire for revenge as well. It made me like them all the more, since I was still seething. I was able to stand near the others without flinching and striking as my rage faded and rationality returned. We got the entire contingent back on the freight elevator and headed to floor 69. I wasn't even tempted to giggle. I hoped that I wasn't losing my fun mental distractions under stress. Mindless fury may be useful, but I liked being a smartass as well. Better than being a dumb one. It was then I realized that I had not lost it. I was still considering ridiculous notions while we worked furiously to save lives rather than to take them. The freight elevator indeed opened on a floor that was well lit and had a cleaner feeling than those where we made involuntary stops. It certainly smelled better than the quickly rotting corpses of the skunk ape goblins. It was spacious and contained several office suites and storage areas. We found the portal in what was clearly a management office, flanked by 2 large potted trees. Real trees, not the plastic monstrosities the corporate world usually favors for display. I locked the doors to the elevator open, and we hauled or carried our injured to the other world. I hoped everything would be in order when we returned, and we would not have to start all over. I also wished we could have simply entered here and avoided all the other mess this night had entailed. We came out near a fort, an eyrie high in some hill country that I would have admired had our situation not been so dire. It turned out to be the territory of the Falcon clan. I wondered whether Lieutenant Falk was from this realm. In any case, there were watchers on duty, and our wounded and slain were quickly taken in hand, and the urgent nature of our quest relayed to the feather-bedecked warriors. Mid Amos and Grier stayed behind with the animal teams, except for the 2 leopards, who had not been severely injured. They accompanied Shabil and stalked close to him on either flank. They and the big bad wolf rushed back through the portal in my wake. We arrived just in time to see our own disappearing forms as they exited with their charges in tow to seek help with the falcons. That was an interesting time warp, I pondered. It was what I'd wanted, but still weird. I kept looking for the snafu. Instead, when I punched the button for the penthouse floor, the door closed and the elevator hummed and creaked and drew us swiftly to our destination. That was where Snafu and Fubar, combined with Murphy and his law, awaited us in earnest. Luck of the Irish, indeed. With the Fae in the other world, one never knew exactly what to expect. Sometimes things were weirdly opulent, like in some fantasy novel, but at other times they were simple and rather plain, but of high quality. Most of the time they were a blend of art and practicality. The penthouse was one great room with a balustrade that led to smaller spaces around the second level, and great sweeping staircases that led upward to that level. On either side of the first floor, between the stairways, like the portal of a castle, sat a kiosk with an ultra-modern desk perched behind a glass counter that was clearly not glass, but some sort of polymer, etched with magnificent vistas of forests and flowered fields. At the desk sat Siobhan. Kotka curled in a comfortable-looking chair near her and licked enthusiastically at his cat parts. He froze and then adjusted himself to a more dignified pose as we exited our coach. I truly despised these 2, and Sorcia's sister or not, I was ready to slaughter them. My face must have reflected the gathering storm, since they looked nervous, even in their own place of power. I caught all of that in a glimpse, since what I saw behind them, in the center of the great space, took up 99.9% ad infinitum to my attention. A tall, narrow ziggurat rose, golden and encrusted with every type of gem imaginable. Yet somehow it had managed to be majestic rather than gaudy, perhaps because it was made with genuine materials and formed by genuine artisans. 4 obelisks stood, one on each corner, in the 4 cardinal directions. Above it all was a crystal dome in the roof that displayed the night sky, with the urine-hewn artificial lights of the city that washed away the view and eternal cold glitter of the stars in the sky above. At the top of the ziggurat perched an enormous figure, also picked out in gold and carved with precision and attention to the last detail. It was the image of a great being with the head of an eagle, the body of a lion, but with bird claws in place of paws on the front legs. Enormous folded wings curved above the majestic head, with its gleaming scimitar beak and glittering eyes of onyx. The shifting of the eyes is what caught my attention and brought me to realize that this was a living being rather than a mere insensate metal image. Again, I took in the scenario at a glance because perched between the talons of the fierce, beautiful, and magnificent being was an even more beautiful and only slightly less fierce being, one that I loved and had striven to find, my Sorcia. She was not in chains as I'd feared. Why would she be when such a perilous creature guarded her? I had no idea how I was going to take on this challenge. Then a clear, lovely feminine laugh rang out from above, near the top of one of the staircases. "Well, husband, you've arrived at last. Clearly the lesser guardians pose no serious threat to one as mighty as yourself." My grandmother. Her tone was mocking, but her eyes gave away her genuine admiration for the Mac Tir Mor. I glanced at that worthy, and he was smiling, not the ferocious wolf grin that he displayed on most occasions, but a genuine, adoring smile that rendered his features almost stunningly handsome. He clearly loved this woman with the passion that infused all of his endeavors. My eyes immediately returned to those of Shorsha. She sat, looking on intently but silently. Her features inscrutable, though I noted a tightness of them, of suppressed emotion. She looked healthy enough, and I wanted to rush to her. I took a shuffling and cautious step forward, and grandmother turned her attention to me. Until the last fight, I thought perhaps our hopes in this one had failed. She indicated me, and I was forced to tear my gaze away from my love to my enemy, a grandmother who appeared to be no older than I. She had started to glide down the stairs. I knew that she used her feet, but the gown she wore hid them, and she walked in a way that made her appear to float. She was clearly a graceful being and powerful. She drew my eyes to her own with her will. Mine sparked with anger at the fact that she held my Sorsha against her will, even as she now held my stare against my own. Sophronia smiled. There it is again, the fire of rage that swelled so magnificently this evening. My little Mac Tir Dirik, so like your parents, a blend of my son and his wife, though you definitely have her eyes. It was such a shame to lose such a fine griffin lady to the washers. But then she was always just a little too sunny in her disposition, despite her mother being a lady of the Raven clan, a handmaiden of the Morrigan herself. Just so. It is how she managed to attract your father's affections. All our clan was left was her less talented sister, your Aunt Tabitha, now also lost to the washers. That family. She rolled her exquisite eyes and shook her fabulously gorgeous head. Her hair sifted and flowed like honey, as my grandfathers described it. She could see that most of this information was new to me, and like any melodramatic villain, she loved to be giving exposition before she pounced. I began to feel warm and removed my cloak. My body itched and I was uncomfortable. I wanted to sit, to fall back in plats for a while. The Mac Tir Mor noticed my flushed and sweaty features and shook his head in discomfiture. Sophronia had reached the first floor and approached to within a few feet. She issued that sweet laughter once again. I see that I have to be brief, Wolfling. Are you thirsty? Perhaps Kotka would be willing to fetch a drink for you. I shook my head and saw from my periphery that the cat being had not even flinched. He was familiar with the games of his superiors, as any familiar should be. Well enough, Rob, that's what your parents called you, she continued. She knew very well who I was, and more of my backstory than I did. You have learned a great deal in a short time about who you are and may yet be. Do you know as much about your young lady love, I wonder? Her smile remained genuine as far as I could tell. I was distracted with a terrible case of hives and sweats. You knew her late father. She glanced at Sorsha, apparently hoping for a stab of emotional pain. But my lovely lass continued to observe dispassionately. He was of the Goose clan. He was a warrior and mariner of great renown. He and your father were fast friends and battle companions for many years. Yet you do not know her mother? She paused dramatically, but I didn't flinch. First, I was too distressed by the assault on my senses, which I attributed to her witchcraft. And second, I'd seen enough movies and read enough novels with clumsy villains to understand that she wanted to shock me. She gave a brief nod to respect my restraint. I see that you have better manners and more restraint than your immediate ancestors. She winked at grandfather, who winked in return and looked on her with, "Oh, gross, they're my grandparents," lust. I shuddered, but was able to return my focus to the conversation rather than my now intense physical discomfort. That mortal woman is the mother of dear Siobhan. It was she who inherited the feigned nature from her blended parentage. Sorcia's mother was a lady of the Seal clan, another great warrior and mariner, who is unfortunately no longer with us. You'll have to ask your grandfather what happened to her, but suffice it to say that your father saved Sean Gosling and his wee daughter from that which took his wife. He glamoured the woman who became his mortal wife when he fled to Mundania. Miss Ellie had already mated with a different fey male of a dark clan and produced a pair of offspring. They became his stepchildren. He glamoured them too, but for Siobhan he wore it off when she reached her first womanly interval in adolescence. Another useless dramatic pause. So you see, your wife-to-be, though she knew it not, is a full fey lady, and the descendant of my mistress, the great witch Caradwyn. She looked toward Siobhan. Sean was not your father, and Sorcia is not your sister, so there will be no taint of kinslaying. Yes? The last word was almost a command. Siobhan's eyes lit and she growled in satisfaction. Kotka tensed in preparation for whatever action his mistress might take, though I took no notice of it, either at the time. I knew who Caradwyn was. Pronouncing a hard C, like K, was from my research. She had been involved in a complicated tale. She had made a potion to assist her son, the ugliest man alive, to gain wisdom to compensate for his features. However, the potion she made required constant attention, and the boy set to stir it, burnt his fingers in it, and when he sucked at his burnt phalanges, the wisdom or knowledge passed to him. She chased him, and they each turned into various predators and prey, until he became a kernel of corn and she a hen, and gobbled him up, potion and all. She then gave birth to the great bard, Taliesin. A brief quip crossed my high-stretched mind at that moment. Was Sorcia a descendant of Taliesin, or that ugly fellow? It was my last clear cognizance for the next several moments that seemed like hours, while we were engaged in our little drama class. The moon had risen and now gleamed through the big moon roof on the building. It was full, and I finally understood that I was foobarred. I hurriedly stripped off the rest of the clothing and accoutrements and fell to the floor in a sprawl. The only item I could not remove, the source of the burning and itching, was the fur belt that I'd habitually strapped on under everything against my skin. I was aware of every wretched pain as my body transformed, and for a short time I stretched helplessly before my friends and foe, writhing like one of our earlier victims on floor 66. They all looked on in various poses of fascination, fear, or perhaps humor. Sorcia now wore a look of fear for me rather than for herself. She rose, and the griffin stirred in preparation to keep her in place. Siobhan and Kotka chose that moment to spring, and a swarm of new attacks erupted down the stairway from above. Shabil and his leopards leapt to the foot of one staircase, and the big bad wolf struck a stance facing the base of the other. When I recovered my senses as much as I was able, I found that my sensory perception had changed. I was oriented lower to the ground, and my vision was overlaid with heat images. Infrared. I noted smells and sounds more strongly than anything, the scent of each occupant in my immediate vicinity. I felt the fur of my ruff raise when I looked at Kotka, who now plunged towards me. Little claw knives, much like the ones I'd been wearing on my outer belt, extended from each of his hands. I'd leapt backward at his advance, still shaken by my transformation. It was a bold move for him, but I knew that he could be brave when necessary. After all, he put a hurt on the king of the cats. Siobhan stood. She stared and raised her arms in some silly over-the-top gesture, like a spellcaster in a B-movie. I had no idea what she was chanting, though I could hear her well despite the cacophony of my friend Shavil's fighting off a horde of bat people. They had wings, and some of them fluttered about the large interior space. Others soared briefly above their comrades to land behind and then attack the valiant ebony warrior and his faithful big cats from the rear. Most simply swarmed down the stairs on their long-toed, sharp claws. They were a good 20 in all. I desperately wanted to leap and tear at the nasty-looking beings, but I had my own determined opponent to address. Kotka swept forward, and at the last moment, Cat-Quick swerved to attack my flank. I wasn't accustomed to this type of fight, so I left my flank momentarily vulnerable and instead snapped my jaws on his arm. I took a small puncture and a long laceration along my ribcage, even as I felt the hot, salty blood on my foeman flow down my throat, and his bones shatter and crunch within my maw. I shook my head, and further rent his flesh and bones, then flung his ravaged form away toward Shabil's fight. Shaban still chanted, and I knew she was attempting some hateful type of magic. I had no idea whether such a thing would work. Then a red cloud appeared behind Shaban's shoulder, and a white arm slid around her throat from behind. Sorcia! My wolf mind screamed in fear for my mate. I feared for her, and the curse of the kinslayer. Then I realized that she was released from that, even more so than Siobhan had been. Siobhan was not of her blood. The Brands would later argue about whether married relations were legally kin, but at this moment all that mattered was that my Sorcia and I were once again fighting as a team. She pulled Siobhan backwards and forced her to her knees once again. The tableau of the fighting sisters was set. This time Sorcia did not hesitate. She did not gloat nor warn. She simply slipped a piece of silk from her stepsister's own garment around the witch's neck, like a noose, and used the cloth to snap her neck as though her arms were limbs of a hanging tree. I gave her a wolf grin and ran towards her, all thoughts of griffins, witches, and raging battles set aside. I reared up and planted my front paws on her shoulders and gave her face a wet, slimy lick, wolf breath and all. I'd intended a passionate kiss, and now I was embarrassed at having forgotten my own condition. She had the good grace to laugh, even as she drew away from the carnivore stink of fresh blood on my breath. I love you too, Rob, but we have to help your friends. I looked around and saw she was right. The bat things were swarming Shavil, and the Mactier faced off against a troll, much like the ones from my favorite bridge, but armed with a stone axe, and with 2 good eyes. Shabil looked to be in more distress at the moment, so I drove into his conflict. I bit and chomped on the creatures. Their flesh was bitter, and their blood thick and dark, and greenish like a combination of sap and snot. It was gratifying to attack them from the rear, even as they had attacked Shabil and the leopards. I leapt into the air and brought down one of the nastier specimens, who had been driving towards the larger leopard. The big cat whirled on me and screeched, roared into my face, all his fangs displayed in primal fury. For a moment I thought he meant to attack me, but my instincts protected him and me both. Deep down I knew this was the battle joy that he expressed to his new brother in arms, since I felt it too, as only wild creatures can. We returned to the struggle and soon had the bat-turds on the run, scrambling or flitting upwards to their lair on the torn and tattered wings. They left a trail of broken bodies and slimy blood and the stench of defeat. I spun around to see how Grandfather fared. He had managed to fend off his much larger opponent, but was now backed up near the kiosk. The troll held the big stone axe and seemed almost casually flick it towards his target. Grandpa's shield splintered into several pieces, Fey-crafted or not. I drove forward, claws clicking on the hard floor, and circled behind the creature. I'd snapped at its cankle, and my teeth rattled as though I'd bitten into a hardwood tree. I did no real damage, but it put off the monster's attack, and it drew its attention away from the spear tip of the Mactier Moor that immediately plunged into the throat of the gargantuan beast, then jogged from side to side to create more damage. I dodged back as the gigantic oaf stumbled backwards, clutching at the spray of dark blood that fanned across its chin and lower face. Soon it lay supine, heels thrumming against the beautiful mosaic tiles of the penthouse floor, as disgusting bodily fluids leaked from it and formed a dark pool. I felt sorry for the poor custodians who would have to clean the building. My grandfather looked at me and shook his head. I guess I should have warned you about the belt. Apparently, you didn't read the Volsunga saga about wolf pelt belts. You'll be okay once the moon reaches his dark phase. Then I suggest you remove the belt until you learn how to use it properly. We looked for Sorsha. Well, I looked for her while Grandpa attended to his friend Shabil, who had taken some wounds, as had his faithful Pantera party. Grandpa wasn't altogether unscathed either. I skidded to a halt when I found her. She looked down at me and shook her head in wonder. I desperately wanted to ask her whether she was okay or had been harmed, but my current vocal apparatus would not accommodate my desires, so I whined and issued a low, comfortable growl. Then I realized something was missing, and that the stench of the city had flooded the big space around us. The griffin was gone. The big crystal dome above us was revealed to be no more than some stupidly expensive retractable sunroof that now gaped into the fading gunk in the air as the sun rose and turned it from regular urine-colored to bloody urine-colored. The ziggurat and obelisks remained, but now appeared to be plastic and plaster and trashy, props for some arrogant corporate weasel to stroke his or her vanity. Grandma Sophronia had obviously decided to leave. She hadn't fled as would any good fictional villain. She simply left, her current project completed. Whatever she wanted to know or convey, she now knew or had communicated. Then my Geas came back to haunt me, in the form of Kotka, whose blood I had unintentionally consumed during our brief skirmish. I was now powerless to act against him. The worthless little monster hadn't had the decency to die from his wounds. He rose from behind the kiosk, and before either of us could act, plunged his little dagger into Sorcia's shoulder. Shabil, who approached with Grandpa, swiftly speared the cat creature through his body and flung him across the room, where he formed a thoroughly dead pile of fur and flesh and rank fluids. His gesture was too late to help my Sorcia. She'd survived being kidnapped and held prisoner, used as a figure to play stupid games with, been held captive between the talons of a griffin, all without injury, only to be felled when we should have been safe. The wound itself wasn't too bad, but the blade had been envenomed, and my love fell and lay stretched on the floor where she convulsed. The big bad wolf quickly put his flasks to her lip and poured some of the healing liquid down her throat, even as the evil cat blood had trickled down my own and created this horror. The convulsions faded, but she looked pale and wan and was clearly headed for death's door. All I could do was look on pleadingly and cut loose with a howl of rage, fear, and pain. We soon had her through the portal, and the Falcon Clan healers, already alerted by our earlier visitor, took her in hand. It was a long wait while they worked furiously to save her, and I could do nothing but pace and moan, and occasionally whine when I could stand it no longer. I'd run about and howl mournfully. All the while my Sorcia lay, fighting an eternal battle, in which I could not aid her except by concentrating all my love towards her healing. I lost track of time one morning. I rose from my pad and looked down at my own naked arms. Shabil and the leopards had long ago returned to their own haunts and hunts with proud new scars and tales to share, at least with one another. Grandfather, also healed of his hurts, stayed with me. We now stood over Sorcia's sick bed, and the falcon medic approached. He gave us a smile. I wish you'd been able to tell me earlier that her mother was a seal clan and her father had become a Selkie. He held up a hand before I could interject. Now we can heal her easily, but there is a cost. Once a month during her, womanly cycle, she will transform into a seal. She has become a Selkie. After a miserable sojourn just outside her room, while the healers worked within, we were allowed to return. The medic who had spoken earlier grinned. She will now heal rapidly. You may stay with her until she awakens, which will be soon. With that, Sorcia's eyes fluttered open and my heart soared. It didn't matter that her glittering emerald orbs currently gazed at me from the countenance of a very lovely red-coated seal. So quoth this raven. There is, of course, much more to come. I've already got 2 stories again to read with Lacey and with Rob. Those timelines, so much more to come, my darlings. Hopefully I will be back on schedule this week and from here on out. Thank you for your patience, my darlings. Have a lovely Thursday. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.